How royal inbreeding created monsters. The Habsburg story. Dios mío. The royal physician crosses himself, staring at what he's just delivered into the world. Madrid, November 6th, 1661. The candles in the birthing chamber burn low, their flames casting twisted shadows against cold stone walls. Outside, church bells wait in silence. Inside, Queen Mariana of Austria has finally stopped screaming. She's been in labor for 18 hours. 3 midwives move around the bed, their faces pale in the flickering light. Royal physicians whisper in Latin hands, trembling as they clutch their useless instruments. The air is thick incense, mixing with sweat and the metallic tang of blood. Everyone in this room knows something is wrong. They can feel it. Then finally a cry. But not the robust wail of a healthy prince. This sound is weak, strained, almost reluctant, as if the child itself knows it shouldn't be here. The head midwife lifts the infant, and for a long moment she simply stares. Her lips move in silent prayer. No one speaks. The baby's jaw protrudes grotesquely, pushing forward, as if the bones of his face had been assembled incorrectly. His tongue, swollen and purple, fills the space where words should someday form, making it impossible for his lips to meet. Saliva already pools at the corners. His limbs hang limp without the healthy tension of newborn muscles. His eyes stare, but do not focus on anything in this world. One of the younger physicians turns away, hand over his mouth. Another crosses himself again, muttering prayers under his breath. This child, this twisted, struggling creature wrapped in royal silk, is Carlos José, Prince of Asturias, future King Carlos II of Spain, heir to an empire that stretches across 3 continents. And from this moment forward, the fate of the Spanish Empire rests on his broken shoulders. The midwife looks at Queen Mariana, searching for words that won't come. Because how do you tell a mother that what she's just brought into the world is not a blessing but a reckoning? The court will later say he was born delicate but noble. They will claim his features carry the proud mark of Habsburg blood refined through generations of royal lineage. Official announcements will describe a healthy prince blessed by God, destined for greatness. But everyone in the birthing chamber knows the truth. Queen Mariana lies back against sweat-soaked pillows, her face grey with exhaustion, and something deeper, something like horror. She has seen her son. She knows what the rest of the empire doesn't yet understand. The head midwife wraps the infant in silk cloth embroidered with the royal crest, lions and castles in golden thread that cost more than most Spaniards earn in a lifetime, as if expensive fabric could hide what lies beneath. Outside the chamber, courtiers wait in hushed clusters, ministers in velvet robes, bishops clutching jeweled crosses, foreign ambassadors who have traveled from across Europe to witness this moment, nobles who have waited years for news of an heir. The heavy oak door opens. A prince, the midwife announces, her voice carefully flat. The kingdom has an heir. For a heartbeat there's silence. Then applause erupts, not loud, not joyous, but dutiful, measured, because this is what courts do. They perform, they maintain the fiction, they pretend. Servants rush through torchlit corridors, carrying the news to the city below. Church bells finally ring, iron clanging across Madrid's red-tiled roofs, echoing off stone walls and through narrow streets where people have been waiting since dawn. In taverns and marketplaces, crowds cheer without knowing why. Long live Prince Carlos José, God save the prince. They have no idea what has just been born in the palace above them. Meanwhile, in the palace chapel, priests gather before gilded icons of saints. They light candles that cost a day's wages each. They recite prayers for the infant's health, for God's blessing upon the royal family, for Spain's glorious future. But some prayers sound more like apologies. Because deep down in a place no courtier will ever speak aloud, in thoughts that will never be written in official records, everyone understands this child is not a blessing. He is a bill come due. For 200 years, the Habsburg dynasty has been writing checks against nature itself, marrying cousins to cousins, uncles wedding nieces, the same bloodlines circling back on themselves again and again, like a snake swallowing its own tail. And now nature has sent an invoice, wrapped in silk, struggling to breathe, his jaw jutting forward where it should recede. His name is Carlos Jose, and before his story ends, he will bury an empire. To understand what created Carlos Jose, you need to understand a single word: purity. Not purity of soul, not purity of faith, not purity of intention, purity of blood. For the Habsburg dynasty, this wasn't just tradition or preference, it was religion, it was law, it was the foundation upon which an empire was built. Royal blood, they believed, carried something sacred, a divine right passed down directly from God himself. To dilute it with common blood, foreign blood, even blood from rival noble families, was unthinkable. It was heresy against the natural order. So they kept it close, very close. Picture a family tree. Most family trees spread outward like an oak branches, extending in different directions, reaching toward new families, new bloodlines, new genetic possibilities. Each generation adds diversity, strength, resilience. The Habsburg tree did something different. It curved inward. Cousins married cousins, then their children married their own cousins. Then those children married back into previous generations, uncles marrying nieces, the same ancestors appearing again and again and again. If you tried to draw it on parchment, the lines wouldn't spread apart into a healthy canopy. They'd loop back on themselves, crossing and recrossing until the whole thing looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot of rope that no one could untie. The court called this preserving the lineage. They called it maintaining the purity of Habsburg blood. They called it God's will. Modern scientists studying these patterns have a different term: genetic collapse. Because here's what the Habsburgs didn't understand, couldn't possibly understand in 1661, 200 years before anyone knew what DNA was. Every human being carries flaws in their blood, small errors, broken instructions that if they appeared would cause problems. Usually these flaws stay hidden. When two unrelated people have children, their different bloodlines balance each other out. One parent's flaw is covered by the other parent's healthy blood. The error gets masked, the problem remains dormant. But when relatives reproduce, when bloodlines are too similar, both parents carry the same flaws, the same errors, the same broken instructions. And those flaws stop hiding. They double, they amplify, they become visible, undeniable, devastating. Queen Mariana of Austria, Carlos Jose's mother, was not just married to King Felipe IV. She was his niece, his brother's daughter, which meant Carlos Jose's father was also his great uncle. Let that sink in for a moment. Now trace it back further. Mariana's parents, cousins. Felipe's parents, also cousins. Their parents, cousins again. Generation after generation after generation, the same bloodlines recycling through the dynasty like water through a poisoned well. The same blood, the same flaws, the same errors, circulating endlessly. By the time Carlos Jose was conceived, his family tree had become so tangled, so impossibly intertwined, that modern scientists, studying it centuries later, would make a shocking discovery. The similarity between his parents' blood was nearly as close as brother and sister. Not because his parents were siblings, they weren't, but because 200 years of cousin marriages, 200 years of turning inward, 200 years of obsessing over purity had created the exact same effect. The Habsburg bloodline once spread across the royal families of Europe like a vast, healthy river had narrowed to a single toxic stream, and every generation drank from it. Some children were lucky. They inherited only minor traits, a distinctive jaw, a slightly elongated face features that portrait painters could soften with careful brushwork and strategic lighting. Others were less fortunate, and Carlos José inherited everything, every accumulated flaw that had been hiding in Habsburg blood for generations, every doubled error, every broken instruction that had been ticking through the centuries, waiting for the perfect storm of similar bloodlines to finally express. He didn't choose this. He didn't ask to be born into a body that was already failing before it took its first breath. But dynasties don't care about children. They care about thrones. They care about crowns. They care about maintaining power, no matter the cost. And so on November the 6th, 1661, as candles burned low in the royal birthing chamber, as priests prayed and courtiers bowed, as church bells rang across Madrid announcing a new prince, the Spanish Empire placed its entire future on the shoulders of an infant who could barely hold up his own head. This is where the story truly begins, not with Carlos José's birth, but with the 200 years of decisions that made him inevitable. Before we watch Carlos José struggle through his 39 years of life, before we see him fail to walk, fail to speak, fail to understand the simplest lessons, fail to produce the heir that Spain desperately needs, before we witness the slow-motion collapse of an empire that once dominated half the known world, we need to go back before his birth, back before his parents' marriage, back before the warning signs appeared in portraits and medical reports, back to when the Habsburg dynasty was young, ambitious, and convinced it had discovered the secret to eternal power. Let's rewind 200 years. The year is 1453. Europe is emerging from the long shadows of the Black Death. Kingdoms are consolidating, trade routes are reopening after decades of plague-induced collapse. And in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling, complicated mess of German territories barely held together by tradition and the thinnest threads of political alliance, a relatively minor, noble family is about to change the course of history. The Habsburgs, you've probably heard the name. Maybe you recognize it from history class, Spanish conquistadors, Austrian emperors, portraits hanging in museums with those distinctive, protruding chins. But in 1453, the Habsburgs are not yet legendary. They're clever, well-connected, strategic, but not yet the most powerful dynasty in Europe. That's about to change. Not through war, not through conquest, not through the clash of armies on muddy battlefields, but through something far more elegant, far more subtle, far more dangerous: wedding invitations. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing in the court of Emperor Federico III. You're in a stone hall lit by candles and winter sunlight filtering through narrow windows. The air smells of wood smoke and old parchment. Maps of Europe spread across heavy wooden tables, not battle plans but genealogies. Family trees traced in careful ink showing who's related to whom, who controls what territory, who's available for marriage. Because Federico has realized something brilliant. Wars are expensive. Soldiers need food, weapons, armor pay. Battles drag on for months, sometimes years. Victory is never guaranteed. Even when you win, you inherit a devastated countryside and resentful subjects. But a wedding is cheap, a wedding is peaceful, a wedding doesn't destroy farmland or burn cities, and a wedding can conquer entire kingdoms. All you need is the right bride or the right groom, and suddenly, through a single ceremony, through vows spoken before a priest, and signatures on a marriage contract, through the exchange of rings and the blessing of bishops, an entire territory falls into your family's hands. No blood spilled, no castles stormed, no years of siege warfare, just a ring, a kiss, and a throne. Federico smiles as he traces his finger across the map of Europe, connecting dots between noble families like a general planning campaign routes. Bella garant ali, he murmurs to himself in Latin. Tu Felix Austria nube. It's a phrase that will become the Habsburg motto, repeated in courts and chronicles for centuries. In English, let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria, marry. This is the seed that will eventually grow into Carlos José's twisted body, his broken mind, his inability to produce the heir that could have saved everything. Because when you build an empire on marriage, when you make family alliances the foundation of all power, eventually you run out of outside families to marry, and you start looking inward at your cousins, your nieces, your own bloodline. You tell yourself it's strategic. You tell yourself it's preserving purity. You tell yourself it's God's will. Until one day, 200 years later, a child is born whose jaw won't close. And you realize nature doesn't negotiate. Let's watch it happen. Vienna, 1477. Emperor Federico III has a problem. His son Maximiliano is 28 years old and ready to marry. And across Europe, every noble family with a daughter of marriageable age is positioning for the match. Because marrying into the Habsburg family means power. The French send letters sealed with royal wax proposing princesses with impressive dowries. The English send gifts hunting hawks, bolts of fine cloth, carefully crafted portraits. Italian duchies dispatch ambassadors with miniature paintings of eligible daughters, each one described in glowing terms. But Federico isn't interested in any of them. He's found someone better. Her name is Maria of Burgundy, and she's just inherited one of the richest territories in all of Europe. Maria is 18 years old, intelligent, well-educated, and sitting on top of an enormous problem. Her father, Duke Carlos the Bold, died 3 months ago on a frozen battlefield run through with Swiss pikes while trying to expand his territories through the very warfare the Habsburgs claim to avoid. Ironic, considering the family motto. But his death left Maria with something extraordinary, the Burgundian Netherlands. Picture it. Wealthy port cities like Brussels, Bruges, and Antwerp, where ships from across the known world dock daily. Trade routes connecting northern Europe to the Mediterranean. Textile industries producing the finest cloth in the world, worth more than gold by weight. Banking houses that finance kings, and Maria controls it all, alone, unmarried, vulnerable. The French king, Louis XI, is already circling like a wolf around wounded prey. He's sending armies toward Burgundian borders, claiming the territory should revert to France by ancient feudal law. His soldiers are burning villages, testing defenses, waiting for the moment to strike. Maria needs protection. She needs an ally. She needs an army. She needs a husband. Federico moves fast. Within weeks, Maximiliano is riding toward Burgundy with a small escort and a marriage contract already drawn up by the finest lawyers in the Holy Roman Empire. The terms are generous to Maria. She retains significant control over her territories. Her titles remain intact. But the real winner is the Habsburg family. The wedding happens on August 19th, 1477. It's a modest ceremony, no time for elaborate pageantry, with French armies threatening the border. A small chapel in Ghent. Essential witnesses, vows exchanged quickly. But when Maximiliano places the ring on Maria's finger, something extraordinary happens. In the cold logic of European politics, the Burgundian Netherlands become Habsburg territory, not through battle, not through siege, not through years of expensive warfare, through marriage. Federico, sitting in Vienna reading the dispatch announcing the successful wedding, allows himself a rare smile. You see, he tells his closest advisor, tapping the parchment with satisfaction, "No soldiers, no siege, just a ring and a signature. That's how we build empires." And he's right. The strategy works perfectly. Over the next 30 years, the Habsburgs deploy the same tactic again and again, like a chess player who's discovered an unbeatable opening. Maximiliano and Maria have children. Their son Felipe grows up handsome, charming, politically savvy, everything a prince should be. Felipe marries Juana of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. The same Ferdinand and Isabella who funded Columbus, conquered Granada and unified the Spanish kingdoms into a single, powerful realm. When Juana eventually inherits the Spanish throne through a combination of deaths and political maneuvering, Spain becomes a Habsburg domain. Just like that. A wedding, a crown, an empire. Then their children marry into other royal lines with calculated precision. Fernando marries Anna of Hungary and Bohemia. When Anna's brother dies without heirs in a catastrophic battle against the Ottomans, Hungary and Bohemia fall to the Habsburgs like ripe fruit from a tree. Maria marries the King of Portugal. Portuguese territories and lucrative trade routes align with Habsburg interests. Within 3 generations, the Habsburg family controls an empire that would have required centuries of warfare to conquer Spain and its rapidly growing overseas empire in the Americas. The Netherlands, with their wealthy trade cities and skilled craftsmen, Austria and associated German territories in the Holy Roman Empire, large parts of Italy, Milan, Naples, Sicily. Hungary and Bohemia, buffer states against Ottoman expansion. If you placed their territories on a map of Europe and colored them in, you'd cover more than half the continent. Add the Americas and the empire literally spans the globe, and they did it almost entirely through weddings. No massive wars, no prolonged sieges, no generations of soldiers dying in muddy fields. Just strategic marriages, carefully planned, perfectly executed. The dynasty becomes legendary across Europe. Foreign ambassadors write home in a mixture of awe and frustration. The Habsburgs do not conquer. They simply marry, and kingdoms fall into their lap like gifts from heaven. Poets compose verses about the family's divine favor. Scholars study their genealogies, marveling at the web of alliances. Other noble families try to copy the strategy but lack the Habsburgs' patience, planning, and sheer geographical advantage. But there's a hidden cost, a cost that nobody sees yet because the science to understand it won't exist for another 400 years. Because as the empire expands through marriage, the pool of acceptable marriage partners shrinks. Think about it carefully. You're a Habsburg prince in the year 1520. You need to marry someone who meets very specific requirements. She must be royal common blood is absolutely unthinkable, barely human in the eyes of the court. She must be Catholic. Religious purity matters almost as much as bloodline. She cannot come from a rival dynasty that might threaten Habsburg power. No French princesses, no English brides, unless politically safe. She should ideally strengthen existing alliances rather than creating new, potentially dangerous ones. That's already a remarkably short list. Now add one more requirement, one that seems innocent at first. Your family already controls most of the major royal houses in Europe through previous marriages, which means most eligible princesses are already related to you. They're your cousins, sometimes your nieces, occasionally both, depending on which branch of the impossibly tangled family tree you follow. And here's where the logic starts to twist into something dangerous. At first, marrying a cousin seems perfectly reasonable. Royal families across Europe do it occasionally. It's not ideal, certainly, but it's not scandalous. It's practical. Then it happens again the next generation, and again. What starts as occasional necessity becomes standard practice, becomes tradition, becomes policy, becomes unwritten law, because every time a Habsburg marries outside the dynasty, there's a risk. What if that foreign family tries to claim Habsburg territories? What if their children feel loyalty to both sides and create succession crises? What if power starts flowing away from Vienna and Madrid toward other capitals? But if you marry within the family, all these problems evaporate. The territories stay Habsburg, the loyalty stays Habsburg, the power stays concentrated in Habsburg hands. And so slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynasty begins turning inward, like a fortress pulling up its drawbridge, like a circle closing. The architects of this strategy, emperors like Federico Maximiliano and later Carlos V, don't see the danger. They see success, undeniable, remarkable success. Territory after territory falling under Habsburg control. An empire so vast that people begin saying the sun never sets on Habsburg lands, and it's literally true. They're too busy celebrating to notice the family tree starting to twist. Too focused on maps and territories to study bloodlines. Too convinced of their own brilliance to ask a simple question. What happens when the same blood circulates through a family for 200 years? The answer is being written in bodies not yet born, in traits doubling back on themselves, in flaws finding their mirror image and amplifying. But in 1500, in 1550, in 1600, nobody understands this. All they see is an empire, and empires, everyone knows, last forever. Don't they? The first visible warnings appeared earlier than Carlos Jose and his great-grandmother, a woman history remembers with a cruel nickname. Valladolid, Spain, 1516. Juana of Castile sits alone in a dim stone room. She's 46 years old, but looks ancient, hair unwashed for weeks hanging in grey tangles. Clothes unchanged, skin pale from lack of sunlight that hasn't touched her face in months. Outside her locked door, servants whisper the name they've given her. Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad. But was she mad from birth, or did something in the Habsburg bloodline break her? Let's go back to when she was young. Juana was born to Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who unified Spain, funded Columbus's voyage to the Americas, established the Spanish Inquisition and transformed their kingdom into a European superpower. Strong rulers, clear-minded, strategic, ruthless when necessary. Their daughter inherited that intelligence. Young Juana spoke 4 languages fluently by age 15. She played musical instruments with skill that impressed professional musicians at court. She impressed foreign diplomats with her wit and political insight that seemed beyond her years. By all contemporary accounts, she was brilliant. Then, at 17, she married Felipe of Habsburg. Felipe the Handsome, they called him, son of Emperor Maximiliano and Maria of Burgundy. Tall, attractive, charming, everything a prince should be on the surface. The marriage was strategic, linking Spain to the Habsburg network of alliances, creating what would become the foundation of the Spanish Habsburg line. But it was also something else, something nobody discussed openly. A cousin marriage, not close cousins, to be fair, but cousins nonetheless connected through previous royal marriages that had intertwined their families decades earlier. The similarity in their blood was smaller than what would come later, but it was there. At the time, this seemed normal, acceptable, the way royal marriages worked. But watch what happens next. Juana becomes obsessed with Felipe in a way that goes beyond normal devotion, dangerously obsessed. When he travels without her, she rages, throwing furniture, screaming at servants until her voice goes hoarse, refusing to eat for days until she collapses from weakness. When she suspects him of infidelity, which happens often because Felipe is indeed chronically unfaithful, she attacks the other women with scissors, cutting off their hair in violent outbursts that terrify everyone who witnesses them. Is this madness, or is this something deeper, a brain struggling with chemistry that's slightly wrong? Modern doctors studying her documented behavior suggest possibilities: severe depression with violent episodes, what we'd now call bipolar disorder, possibly early onset mental illness with genetic components. All conditions that become more likely when bloodlines are too closely related, when similar flaws appear in both parents and amplify in their children. But in 1506, when Felipe dies suddenly, possibly poisoned, possibly disease, the court never agrees on which Juana's mental state completely collapses. She refuses to let his body be buried. Instead, she has his coffin placed in her chambers. She speaks to it daily as if Felipe can still hear her, still respond, still love her back. She orders it open periodically, checking to see if he's decomposed yet, if he's still dead, if maybe, please God, he'll wake up. When her father finally forces her into confinement for her own safety and the safety of the kingdom, she spends the next 46 years locked in a small room in Tordesillas. 46 years. Mad Juana. A tragedy, certainly, but also a warning sign that nobody heeds, because Juana and Felipe had 6 children together before his death. And those children, products of 2 Habsburg bloodlines, converging, carrying similarities that should have raised alarms, would carry the pattern forward into the next generation. One of them is Carlos V, future Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of the largest empire in European history up to that point, and carrier of the Habsburg jaw. Brussels 1530. Emperor Carlos V stands before a full-length mirror in his private chambers. He's 30 years old, in the prime of life. He's just been crowned Holy Roman Emperor in an elaborate ceremony at Aachen. He controls Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, parts of Italy, and a rapidly expanding empire in the Americas, where Spanish conquistadors are discovering civilizations and gold. When he signs a document, kingdoms obey. When he speaks, ambassadors from across the known world bow and listen carefully. When he goes to war, half of Europe mobilizes. He is without question the most powerful man on earth. But he can't fully close his mouth. His lower jaw protrudes forward noticeably. Not dramatically, not like it will in his descendants, but enough that it's visible even to casual observers. His teeth don't align properly. Chewing certain foods is difficult. He avoids hard meats, prefers softer preparations. Portrait painters know to angle his face carefully to use shadow and perspective that minimizes the prominence of his jaw. They paint him in 3/4 profile, never straight on. They use darkness cleverly. But Carlos sees it every morning in the mirror, the Habsburg jaw, carried through his mother Juana, through his father Felipe, through the converging bloodlines that created him. Does he connect it to his mother's madness, locked away in Tordesillas, talking to corpses? Does he wonder if the bloodline is flawed in ways that crowns and territories can't compensate for? We don't know what he thought in those private moments. What we do know is this: Carlos V married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal. Isabella was beautiful by all accounts, intelligent, politically savvy. She served as regent of Spain during Carlos's frequent absences, handling government affairs with skill that impressed even skeptical ministers. But she was also Carlos's first cousin on his father's side, which meant their children would inherit Habsburg blood from both parents. A double dose of the same material. They had 6 children together. 3 died in infancy, not unusual for the 1500s, certainly, but a higher mortality rate than average for royal families with access to the best physicians and care. The survivors showed the pattern strengthening, becoming more visible. Felipe II, their eldest son, had the jaw, more pronounced than his father's. Portrait painters had to work harder to minimize it. Maria had it too, though less severe, as was common in Habsburg women whose features generally showed the trait more subtly. Juana, named after Carlos's troubled mother, showed signs of mental instability even as a child. Mood swings, periods of deep melancholy that lasted for weeks, strange behaviors that worried her caretakers. The pattern continues generation by generation like a debt-collecting interest. Philippe II grows up knowing he'll inherit the empire. He's educated by the finest tutors, trained in languages, politics, military strategy. He's competent, devout, hard-working, everything a king should be. But when it comes time for him to marry, the court faces a problem. The pool of acceptable brides has shrunk dramatically. France, political rival, absolutely not. England, complicated, dangerous Protestant. Portugal, already intermarried multiple times. German states, most are Protestant now, religiously unacceptable. Then someone suggests Maria Manuela of Portugal. Felipe's cousin, actually his double cousin, related through both his mother's and father's sides of the family. The similarity in their blood is roughly equivalent to half-siblings, but this doesn't alarm anyone in the court. Why would it? The Habsburg strategy has worked brilliantly for a century now. The empire continues to expand. The family controls more territory than any dynasty in history. Surely the pattern can continue without consequence. The marriage happens in 1543. Felipe is 16, Maria is 15, young, healthy, royal. A year later, they have a son, Don Carlos. And this is where the cracks in the bloodline become impossible to ignore, where the accumulated weight of generations of intermarriage produces something that even the most optimistic courtier cannot explain away. Don Carlos is born screaming, but unlike normal newborn cries that quickly settle into regular breathing, there's something wrong with the sound. High-pitched, strained, like an animal caught in a trap. The midwives notice immediately his jaw. It's worse than his father's, worse than his grandfather's. It juts forward so far that his tongue barely fits inside his mouth. As he grows, the problems multiply like compound interest. He doesn't walk until age 7, wobbling on weak legs that can barely support his weight. Speech is difficult, words come out garbled, wet, incomprehensible to anyone not accustomed to his attempts. His teeth never align. Eating is a struggle. He chokes frequently on foods other children manage easily. But worse than all the physical deformities, his mind. Don Carlos shows signs of severe disturbance from early childhood, violent tantrums that last for hours, during which servants must physically restrain him to prevent injury to himself and others. Cruel treatment of animals he's caught, burning cats alive, throwing dogs from windows to watch them fall. Cruel treatment of servants, beating them with whatever's at hand, sometimes laughing while he does it. Behavior that alternates between catatonic silence, where he'll sit staring at walls for entire days, and explosive rage, during which he's dangerous to everyone around him. At age 22, in a fit of anger over some perceived slight, he throws a servant down a flight of stairs. The man breaks his back and dies 3 days later in agony. His own father, King Felipe II, begins to fear him. Court doctors try everything in their limited medical arsenal, bloodletting to balance the humours, herbal remedies gathered from across the empire, exorcisms performed by senior priests, holy water splashed on his face while he screams and fights against restraints. Nothing helps. In 1568, Felipe makes a heartbreaking decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He has his own son arrested and confined to his chambers for the safety of the kingdom and the royal family. Guards are posted, doors are locked. Don Carlos is not allowed visitors. 6 months later, at age 23, Don Carlos is dead. Officially fever, unofficially possibly starved himself in protest, possibly poisoned on quiet orders, possibly simply gave up on living in a body and mind that betrayed him constantly. The court breathes a quiet sigh of relief that nobody would dare voice aloud, because everyone from the lowest servant to the highest bishop understood one terrible truth. Don Carlos should never have worn a crown. But here's the terrifying part, the detail that should have changed everything. The dynasty learned nothing. Because even as Don Carlos died, even as his twisted body and broken mind proved beyond any doubt the danger of too close marriages, even as Felipe II mourned the loss of his only son, the Habsburgs kept marrying cousins, kept turning inward, kept trusting that royal blood would protect them from consequences. The circle kept closing. And one generation later, a child would be born who made even Don Carlos look fortunate by comparison. Let's pause the story for a moment, because by now you're probably wondering, how did the Habsburgs not see this coming? How could an entire dynasty, advised by the smartest minds in Europe, guided by scholars who studied ancient texts and modern philosophy, counseled by physicians trained at the finest universities, keep making the same mistake for 200 years? The answer is simple, and it's not stupidity. They didn't know what genes were. Imagine trying to bake a cake without understanding that ingredients exist. You just know that you mix some stuff together, put it in an oven, apply heat, and sometimes you get something delicious. Sometimes you get something inedible that even dogs won't touch. When you get a good cake, you try desperately to remember exactly what you did. Was it a Thursday? Was the oven hotter? Did you stir clockwise? Did you pray to the right saint? When you get a bad cake, you blame external factors, the oven temperature, the weather, the position of the stars, divine displeasure with your sins. But you never think, maybe the flour was contaminated, maybe I used rotten eggs, maybe the recipe itself is fundamentally flawed, because you don't understand ingredients, you don't understand chemistry, you don't understand cause and effect at that level. That's the Habsburgs with genetics. Here's what they didn't know, couldn't possibly know. Every human carries roughly 20,000 instructions for building a body. These instructions determine everything from your height, to your hair color, to your jaw structure, to how your brain handles emotions. You inherit half from your mother, half from your father. Most instructions come in pairs, 2 copies of the same blueprint, 1 from each parent. If one copy is flawed, let's say it builds a jaw that doesn't develop properly, usually the other copy compensates. Your body reads the healthy instruction and ignores the faulty one. This is why mixing bloodlines is protective. When 2 unrelated people have children, their instructions are different enough that flaws in one parent usually get covered by healthy versions from the other parent. The errors get masked, the broken blueprints don't express. But when relatives reproduce, when bloodlines are too similar, both parents are more likely to carry the same flaws in the same instructions, the same errors, the same broken blueprints, and those flaws stop hiding. They double up, they amplify, they become visible, undeniable, devastating. Picture it like a deck of cards. Normally you're shuffling 52 different cards, hearts, diamonds, clubs, spades, all mixed together. But the Habsburgs kept removing cards from their deck. Every cousin, marriage eliminated more variety. Every generation, fewer unique cards remained, until they were shuffling the same 20 cards over and over, drawing the same hands repeatedly. Same patterns, same flaws, the same disasters. Modern scientists can measure this. They call it the inbreeding coefficient. It measures how similar someone's parents' bloodlines are. For most people, that number is close to 0. Your parents are complete strangers in their blood sharing, no more similarity than any 2 random humans. For first cousins, marrying, the number jumps to about 0.0625. For the later Habsburgs, after generations of repeated marriages within the family, after the bloodlines had looped back on themselves dozens of times, the coefficient reached levels comparable to siblings having children. Not because siblings were marrying directly, that would have been scandalous even by Habsburg standards, but because the same bloodlines had circulated through the family so many times, had crossed and recrossed so frequently, that the distance between relatives had collapsed to nearly nothing. And here's the crucial part that explains Carlos Jose. The traits that appear aren't random. They're the traits that were always hiding in the bloodline waiting, like a flaw that needs two matching copies to show itself. One copy hidden, harmless, invisible. Two copies expressed, visible, sometimes devastating. The first Habsburgs probably carried instructions for the jaw mutation, but it was minor, barely noticeable, easily masked by healthy instructions from their unrelated spouses. They also probably carried instructions for mental illness, for developmental delays, for immune problems, for 100 other potential issues. But in a diverse bloodline with fresh material coming in every generation, these flaws stayed buried. Then they started marrying cousins, and those flaws found matching copies and started expressing. Generation by generation, the traits got stronger, the jaw became more pronounced, the mental instability more common, the physical weakness more severe, the fertility problems more frequent, until finally in 1661, all of those accumulated flaws, 200 years of errors collecting like interest on a debt, found each other in a single child, Carlos Jose. Now the Habsburgs couldn't have known any of this. The monk Gregor Mendel wouldn't discover the basic laws of heredity until 1866, 200 years too late to save the dynasty. The structure of DNA wouldn't be understood until 1953. So when Habsburg physicians looked at Don Carlos's protruding jaw, or Juana's madness, or Carlos Jose's inability to walk, they didn't think inherited disorder caused by related parents. They thought witchcraft, divine punishment, imbalance of bodily fluids, unfortunate bad luck, the will of God testing the faithful. They bled patients to release bad blood. They prescribed herbs to restore balance. They performed exorcisms to drive out demons. They prayed to saints for intercession. They consulted astrologers about planetary alignments. They never once considered that the problem was the family tree itself. That marrying your niece wasn't a political strategy, it was a genetic time bomb, and the Habsburgs had been winding that clock for 200 years. In November 1661, in a stone chamber in Madrid, surrounded by candles and prayers and desperate hope, that clock finally struck midnight. Madrid, 1649. King Philippe IV of Spain stands at a window, forehead pressed against cold glass, watching winter rain turn the royal gardens to mud. He can hear the drip of water from stone gargoyles, smell the damp creeping through palace walls, feel the weight of a crown that isn't on his head right now, but presses on his shoulders nonetheless. He's 44 years old. He's been king for 26 years, and he's watching his empire slowly crumble. This is not the Spain of his grandfather Carlos V, when the empire was young and wealthy and seemingly invincible. This is not even the Spain of his father Felipe III, when there was still momentum, still hope, still the illusion of permanence. This is Spain in decline, and everyone knows it. The treasury is bankrupt, drained by endless wars with France, England, and rebellious Dutch provinces that refuse to accept Spanish rule despite decades of fighting. The silver mines of the Americas, once seemingly infinite, can't keep pace with Spain's debts. The galleons still arrive from across the Atlantic, holds full of precious metal, but the gold flows out even faster to pay soldiers, bribe allies, service loans from German banking houses. Plague sweeps through cities, killing tens of thousands. The streets of Seville smell of death. Harvests fail across Castile, the heartland withering. Taxes crush the population until peasants abandon fields and flee to cities or take ships to the Americas, desperate for anything better than this. And Felipe's own family is dying. His first wife, Isabella of Bourbon, gave him multiple children over 15 years of marriage. Only one survived past age 10, a daughter useless for succession. His heir, Prince Baltasar Carlos, seemed healthy for years. Strong, intelligent, everything Spain needed for the future. Portrait painters showed him on horseback, looking vigorous and capable, the hope of the dynasty. Then at 16, Balthasar caught smallpox and died within days, body covered in pustules, burning with fever that no physician could reduce. Felipe stood over his son's body and felt the weight of an empire pressing on his shoulders until he could barely breathe. No air, no sun, no future. The dynasty balanced on a knife's edge over an abyss. Felipe remarried out of pure necessity. Not for love, he barely knew the woman before the wedding. Not for alliance, she brought no particular political advantage to speak of. For survival. The court compiled lists of eligible candidates with clinical detachment. The requirements were clear: Catholic, absolutely essential, non-negotiable. Royal blood, common marriages were unthinkable even now. Young enough to bear multiple children, preferably teenagers who could give him a decade of attempts. Politically acceptable, no one who would cause international incidents. But there was one more requirement that nobody stated in official documents, but everyone understood in their bones: Habsburg. Because after 200 years of intermarriage, the dynasty had become so obsessed with bloodline purity that marrying outside the family felt like betrayal, like admitting defeat, like diluting the divine right that justified their entire rule. The choice was made quickly. Mariana of Austria, Felipe's niece, his brother's daughter. Let's be very clear about what this means, about the exact nature of this relationship. Mariana's father was Fernando III, Holy Roman Emperor. Fernando was Felipe's younger brother, born to the same parents sharing the same blood, which made Mariana literally Felipe's brother's daughter. They shared grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. If you drew their family tree accurately, you'd need to draw connecting lines between the same ancestors multiple times, the parchment becoming a maze. Mariana was 14 years old when the betrothal was announced. Felipe was 42. She was young enough to be his daughter. She was by blood nearly as close as a daughter. The similarity they shared was almost equivalent to a parent-child relationship. But royal courts don't think in terms of blood similarity. They think in terms of thrones, territories, treaties, power. And Mariana carried Habsburg blood on both sides. Her father's line and her mother's, who was also a Habsburg through previous cousin marriages that had tangled the tree even further. Perfect, the court advisors said, nodding with satisfaction around a table covered in genealogical charts. The bloodline will remain pure. The crown will stay firmly in family hands. No foreign influence to complicate succession. They had no idea what they'd just done. No idea that they'd just loaded the chamber for a catastrophe. The wedding took place on October the 7th, 1649. A 14-year-old girl married to her 42-year-old uncle in a ceremony that followed every proper protocol, blessed by bishops, witnessed by nobility, recorded in official chronicles as a joyous occasion for the kingdom. Contemporary accounts describe Mariana as delicate in constitution, pale, frail, quiet, obedient, as a well-trained daughter. She'd been raised in the Austrian court, taught languages, music, embroidery, dancing, all the accomplishments expected of a princess destined for marriage. But she was also a Habsburg through and through, which meant she carried the accumulated load of 2 centuries of intermarriage, all those flawed instructions hiding in her blood. And Felipe, 42, exhausted, desperate for an heir, carried the same load, the same flaws, the same broken blueprints, waiting to find their match. When their blood combined in the child that would become Carlos Jose, it was like pouring gasoline on embers that had been smoldering for generations. Mariana became pregnant quickly, which the court took as a good sign. Prayers were offered in every church in Spain, masses held daily, astrologers consulted to determine auspicious dates and signs. Everyone prayed for a son, a strong son, a healthy heir who would secure the dynasty for another generation. In July 1651, Mariana gave birth. A daughter. They named her Margarita Teresa. The court masked its disappointment behind polite congratulations, painted smiles, carefully worded letters to foreign courts. A daughter is a blessing, a princess to make advantageous marriages abroad, and the next child will surely be a son. Mariana became pregnant again, another daughter in 1655, dying within months. Then Felipe Prospero in 1657. Finally a prince. A boy, the court rejoiced. Bells rang across Madrid. Te Deums were sung in every chapel, but Felipe Prospero was sickly from his first breath. He couldn't nurse properly, his digestion was wrong in ways physicians couldn't understand or fix. He caught every illness that passed through the palace, fevers that wouldn't break, coughs that lasted for months, skin that bruised at the slightest touch. He died at age 4, having barely lived at all, back to no heir, no future, no hope. Mariana, now in her mid-20s, had already buried multiple children in small coffins. The stress was visible in her face. Portraits from this period show a woman who looks decades older than her years, deep lines around her mouth, eyes that have seen too much loss, hands that tremble when she thinks no one is watching, but she was the queen. And the queen's job, the only job that really mattered in the logic of monarchy, was to produce heirs. She became pregnant one more time. This pregnancy was different from the start. Difficult in ways that frightened even experienced midwives who delivered hundreds of babies. Mariana suffered violent nausea that left her unable to eat for days, ribs showing through her skin. Fainting spells sent her crashing to stone floors, leaving bruises that took weeks to heal. Pains that sent the royal physicians into panic, consulting ancient texts for guidance they couldn't find. Something felt wrong from the beginning. The court whispered behind closed doors in shadowed corridors. Some said she was cursed, that God was punishing the family for unnamed sins stacking like debts. Others blamed witchcraft enemies of Spain using dark magic against the royal line. A few wondered quietly, carefully, never in writing, if the Habsburg bloodline had finally been pushed too far. If nature itself was rejecting what they'd created through 2 centuries of marriages that never should have happened. But on November the 6th, 1661, ready or not, wanted or not, Mariana went into labor. 18 hours of agony while physicians paced and prayed and tried treatments that did nothing. 3 midwives working in rotation because the labor was so long, so difficult, so unlike anything they'd seen before. Endless prayers muttered under trembling breaths. Candles burning down to stubs and being replaced. And then a cry. Weak, strained, almost reluctant, as if the child knew what awaited. Prince Carlos José had arrived. The last Spanish Habsburg, the final bill come due for 2 centuries of choices that seemed so reasonable at the time. The reckoning made flesh. What happened next would unfold over 39 years. 39 years of pretense and decay. 39 years of an empire watching its future die slowly. Let's watch it happen month by month, year by year. Royal Palace, Madrid, 1662. Carlos José is 6 months old. A healthy 6-month-old infant should be achieving certain developmental milestones that physicians and midwives recognize. Sitting up with support from adults or cushions. Reaching for objects with increasing coordination, making babbling sounds. Mama, Baba, Dada, the building blocks of language that every parent waits to hear. Responding to voices turning toward familiar sounds. Smiling at faces, especially parents. Showing curiosity about the world, about textures and colors and movement. Carlos José does none of these things. He lies in his ornate cradle, carved walnut wood inlaid with gold leaf lined with silk that costs more than a farmer earns in a year, and his eyes track nothing. Not faces leaning over him with desperate hope, not toys dangled before his eyes by increasingly worried servants, not the elaborate mobile of painted angels suspended above his head. His gaze passes through people, through objects, as if he's looking at something beyond this world that only he can perceive. His head lolls to one side, too heavy for his weak neck muscles to support properly, and his lips never meet, because his jaw, that cursed Habsburg jaw, already pronounced at 6 months, makes closing them nearly impossible. Wetness runs down his chin in streams that never stop. Servants change him 3 times a day, not for normal infant reasons, but because the saliva saturates everything it touches, soaking through silk and linen. Queen Mariana sits beside the cradle for hours each day. Sometimes she prays, rosary beads clicking through her fingers, lips moving in silent appeals to the Virgin Mary, to Saint James, to any saint who might intercede on behalf of her broken child. Sometimes she just watches, waiting for some sign, any sign that her son will be normal, that this is just slow development, that he'll catch up, that the physicians are right when they say, with forced optimism, "Some children simply need more time, Your Majesty." She's 26 years old, but looks 40. The difficult pregnancy destroyed her health. The traumatic birth nearly killed her bleeding. That wouldn't stop pain that made her scream until her voice gave out. And now this child who doesn't smile, doesn't coo, doesn't respond when she speaks to him in the gentle voice mothers use. The physicians visit daily with their bags of useless tools. They examine the infant prince with furrowed brows and concerned murmurs conducted in Latin so the servants won't understand the full extent of their worry. One suggests more sunlight, perhaps the child's humors are too cold and wet, the balance needs warmth. Another recommends a change in the wet nurse's diet, maybe something in her milk is causing the problems, though no one can say what. A third, more desperate, proposes bloodletting. Perhaps the infant has too much blood pooling in his head, causing pressure that prevents normal development. None of them say aloud what they're all thinking in the privacy of their own minds. This child should not be alive. That his survival past the first month is itself a kind of miracle, or curse, depending on your perspective and your faith. Carlos José's first birthday arrives in November 1662. The court organizes a small celebration, nothing extravagant, given Spain's financial crisis and empty treasury, but dignified enough to mark the heir's survival to 1 year, which, given infant mortality rates, is genuinely an achievement. A cake brought from the royal kitchens, layers of honey and almonds, musicians playing gentle court music in a corner, nobles gathering in their finest clothes to pay respects and offer carefully worded congratulations that mean nothing. Carlos José is propped in a special chair padded with cushions, surrounded by supports to keep him upright, because he still cannot sit unassisted, his spine too weak, his muscles undeveloped. He doesn't react to the music floating through the room, doesn't turn his head toward the musicians or show any sign he hears them, doesn't reach for the cake when it's brought near, fingers limp. When courtiers approach to bow and offer birthday wishes, his eyes slide past them, unfocused, seeing something that isn't there, or perhaps seeing nothing at all. One noble attempting conversation with another while watching the prince whispers, "His Highness seems contemplative, lost in thought beyond his years." Perhaps he ponders matters of state already. It's a polite lie that both men know is false, but repeat anyway, because the alternative is unthinkable. Carlos José isn't contemplative. He isn't thinking deep thoughts about theology or governance. He's developmentally delayed in ways the court doesn't have language to describe, in ways that won't be properly understood for another 300 years. But the performance continues because that's what courts do, what they've always done. Portraits are commissioned showing a healthy, robust infant, plump cheeks, bright, alert eyes, sitting confidently on cushioned chairs with a regal bearing. These paintings will be sent to foreign courts across Europe as proof that Spain's future is secure, that the Habsburg line continues strong and vital. In reality, Carlos Jose can barely hold up his own head without support. Most children learn to walk between 12 and 18 months, some as early as 9 months toddling with joy, others as late as 15 or 16 months, but by 18 months, almost all healthy children are walking, exploring, getting into everything. Carlos Jose doesn't walk at 2 years old, or 3. At 4 years old, he still cannot stand without support, cannot take even a single step without servants holding him upright, bearing most of his weight. His legs are weak bone and muscle development delayed by whatever catastrophe created him by the accumulated weight of generations finally expressing in fragile flesh. Tutors are brought in to begin his education because this is the age when royal children normally start learning the basics. Letters, numbers, simple words in Latin, Spanish, French, scripture passages, prayers every Catholic child learns, catechism. The tutors try, with genuine dedication and hope. They show him illustrated books with beautiful hand-painted letters, hoping the colors will catch his attention and hold it. They speak to him in Latin, Spanish, French, repeating simple words slowly and clearly. Pater mater, Deus rex. They place wooden blocks in front of him, hoping he'll stack them, showing basic understanding of cause and effect, of spatial relationships. He doesn't. He can't focus on anything for more than a few seconds before his attention drifts away to nothing in particular, eyes unfocusing, mind going elsewhere. When spoken to directly, he doesn't respond. Not with words, not with gestures, not with any sign of comprehension, just that same blank stare that chills everyone who sees it, that makes them wonder if anyone is home inside that small body. One tutor, a learned Jesuit priest named Father Sebastian, who studied at Salamanca and speaks 6 languages, reports to Queen Mariana after 3 months of daily lessons. "Your Majesty, forgive me, but the prince doesn't understand. I've tried every method I know. He cannot grasp even the simplest lessons. His mind appears elsewhere, absent. I cannot reach him." Mariana's face hardens like stone jaw clenching. "Continue the lessons, Father. God will grant him understanding in time. We must have faith. We must pray harder." Father Sebastian bows deeply and returns to his impossible task, spending hours each day sitting with a child who shows no sign of learning anything at all, no sign of progress, no sign of hope. But not all problems can be hidden with patience and prayer and wishful thinking. The prince's tongue, swollen purple, too large for his malformed mouth, makes speech nearly impossible. When he does make sounds, they're garbled, wet, incomprehensible to anyone not accustomed to his attempts at communication. Ah, ga, ma, random syllables with no pattern, no meaning, no progression toward language or coherent thought. The court physicians try interventions with increasing desperation. They massage his tongue daily, hoping to reduce the swelling through manipulation and prayer. They prescribe herbal rinses made from bitter plants imported at great expense from the Americas. They consult ancient texts from Greek and Arab scholars looking for similar cases, and their treatments finding nothing that helps. Nothing works, because the problem isn't medical in any way their medicine can address. It's structural, built into his bones and flesh by instructions that went catastrophically wrong before he was even conceived. Carlos Jose's jaw is so misaligned, so malformed, that his tongue has nowhere to rest properly inside his mouth. It blocks his airway. When he sleeps, wet, choking sounds echo through his chambers at night, frightening servants who hear him struggling to breathe in the darkness. Attendants are stationed by his bed at all times, ready to turn him on his side when his breathing stops, when the gurgling sounds indicate he's choking on his own saliva. More than once, they've saved his life. More than once, they've wondered if they should. Finally, at age 6, Carlos Jose takes his first steps, unsteady, wobbling, like a very old man walking on a ship's deck during a storm, grabbing for support that isn't there. The court celebrates as if he's just conquered a nation, as if he's won a great military victory against impossible odds. A miracle the bishops proclaim from pulpits across Madrid, their voices ringing with forced enthusiasm. God's favor has touched the Prince Divine. Intervention has granted him strength. Our prayers have been answered. Queen Mariana weeps with relief, clutching her rosary, thanking the Virgin Mary for this blessing, for this sign that perhaps everything will be all right after all. But anyone watching closely, anyone not blinded by desperate hope and political necessity, can see the truth. Carlos Jose doesn't walk normally. His gait is lurching, uncoordinated, each step a barely controlled fall forward that could end in collapse. His feet drag across stone floors, making scraping sounds that echo through empty corridors. His balance is poor. He sways constantly, overcorrecting, nearly falling with each movement. He needs servants walking beside him at all times, hands hovering near his elbows, ready to catch him when he stumbles. And he stumbles often, sometimes multiple times, crossing a single room. By age 7, he can walk short distances without direct support, perhaps 20 feet, before exhaustion forces him to stop, chest heaving. But running impossible. His legs simply cannot coordinate that level of movement. Climbing stairs only with help, servants practically carrying him up each step. Standing for extended periods, he sways, trembles, eventually collapses if not seated within minutes. Meanwhile, his education has failed entirely and completely. After 5 years of daily tutoring, after thousands of hours of patient instruction, Carlos Jose cannot read a single word, not even his own name written in large letters. Write anything beyond random marks that might charitably be called scribbles. Recite even the most basic prayers that every Catholic child learns before age 5. Answer simple questions like, "What is your name?" or "Who is your mother?" The tutors give up, though they won't admit it in those words. Not officially, they still arrive each morning, still sit with the prince, still go through the motions of teaching, but everyone knows it's pure performance now. Theatre to maintain the fiction that this child might someday be educated enough to rule an empire that stretches across the known world. Carlos Jose will never be educated. His mind, whatever capacity it might have had under different circumstances, seems locked behind some impenetrable fog that no amount of patient instruction can pierce or penetrate. He sits during lessons, wetness running down his chin in constant streams, his gaze directed at nothing in particular. Sometimes he makes sounds, random syllables strung together without meaning or pattern. Sometimes he reaches for objects on the table and misses completely, his depth perception broken, his spatial awareness non-existent. Sometimes he just weeps, soft, confused crying like a child lost in a dark forest who doesn't understand where he is or how he got there or why no one can help him. And the tutors sit there, trapped in this awful charade, pretending that someday, somehow, this child will be fit to rule one of the largest empires on earth. In the hallways outside his chambers, servants whisper when they think no one important is listening. Some say he's cursed, that the family's sins have caught up with them, that God is punishing the Habsburgs for pride and ambition. Others claim witchcraft, that enemies of Spain have placed a spell on the royal family, corrupting the heir to destroy the dynasty. The more superstitious cross themselves when passing his door, as if his condition might spread like plague, as if proximity to him might bring misfortune. A few suggest very quietly in conversations that would be treason if overheard by the wrong ears that perhaps the prince should be removed from succession, placed in a monastery somewhere quiet, somewhere peaceful, somewhere far from Madrid. Let the crown pass to a cousin, a distant relative, anyone capable of actually ruling. But these whispers never reach the throne room. They never reach Queen Mariana's ears. Because Mariana will not hear of it, will not tolerate even the suggestion. Carlos Jose is her son. He is the legitimate heir born in wedlock to a king and queen, and he will be king no matter what, even if his mind never develops beyond that of a small child, even if his body never strengthens and never becomes capable of the physical demands of kingship, even if every single person in the palace absolutely knows with certainty that this child should never wear a crown, should never hold power over millions of lives. The performance will continue for 32 more years, until death finally ends what never should have begun. Royal Palace, Madrid, 1669. Carlos Jose is 8 years old, and today, for the first time in his life, he's being dressed in armor. Not real armor. He couldn't possibly bear the weight of actual battle plate, the kind his ancestors wore into combat. This is ceremonial armor made of thin steel, carefully painted to look impressive from a distance. It weighs perhaps 5 pounds. He can barely stand in it. Today is a public appearance, the first time Carlos Jose will be shown to the people of Madrid beyond the palace walls, beyond the carefully controlled world of courtiers who know how to avert their eyes. The royal advisors have debated this decision for months in tense meetings behind closed doors. Some argued it's too risky. What if the prince falls from his horse? What if he cannot maintain composure? The people will see the truth, and once they see, we cannot make them unsee. But Queen Mariana insisted with the force of absolute authority, with the desperation of a mother who needs to believe her son is normal. He is their prince. They must see him. They must know the Habsburg line continues strong. We cannot hide him forever, like some shameful secret. So servants dress him with infinite care. The lightweight armor over a padded doublet to protect his fragile bones from the metal. A crimson cape across his shoulders, secured so it won't slip and reveal the supports beneath. A small ceremonial sword at his hip tied firmly in place because his hands lack the strength to hold even its minimal weight. They position him on a white horse carefully selected for its calm temperament, a mare so docile she barely reacts to anything. He's not riding exactly, more like he's been arranged on the saddle like a piece of furniture, with servants walking on either side, ready to catch him if he slides off. The procession begins its slow journey through Madrid. Through the narrow streets between Plaza Mayor and the Alcazar, people pack every balcony and doorway. They've been waiting for this since before dawn. The smell of roasting chestnuts mixes with horse manure and unwashed crowds pressed together in the autumn heat. A street vendor selling meat pies stops mid-shout, staring like everyone else. Pressed against buildings hanging from windows, children hoisted onto parents' shoulders for a better view. For 8 years, rumors have swirled through the city about the prince like smoke. Some say he's magnificent, a future warrior king who will restore Spain's fading glory, who will make the empire great again. Others whisper darker things, that he's sickly, that something is wrong, that the court is hiding terrible secrets behind painted portraits. Now they'll finally see for themselves. The royal procession rounds the corner into the main plaza. First come the royal guard's polished armor, gleaming in sunlight, horses, stepping in perfect formation, a display of military might. Then the banners, golden red lions and castles, the symbols of Spanish power snapping in the breeze. Then the prince, and the crowd hesitates. This is not what they expected. This is not the magnificent future king they'd imagined from the official announcements. Carlos Jose sits on the white horse, but he's not sitting upright like a prince should. He's slumped forward, clearly held in place by servants' hands, barely hidden behind the horse's flanks. His head lolls to one side, unable to support its own weight. His jaw hangs open even at this distance. People can see the wetness glistening on his chin, catching sunlight. His eyes don't focus on the crowd, don't acknowledge their presence, don't see them at all. They stare somewhere past everything into nothing. For a long moment there's uncomfortable silence. Mothers pull their children closer. Men exchange glances. Everyone is thinking the same thing, but no one wants to say it first. Then scattered and uncertain, Viva el Principe, long live the prince. But the cheers sound hollow, forced more like a question than a declaration. People are looking at each other with confused, worried expressions. Is this really their future king? Is this what will rule Spain when King Felipe dies? Is this what 200 years of Habsburg glory has produced? The procession continues through the streets, but the enthusiasm doesn't build the way it should for a royal appearance. The cheers remain scattered, half-hearted, dying quickly in the autumn air. When it finally ends and Carlos José is returned to the palace, carefully lifted from his horse and carried inside like a child, Queen Mariana asks her advisors how it went. "Magnificently, Your Majesty." They lie with practiced smoothness, with the ease of courtiers who've spent years saying what needs to be said rather than what's true. The people were deeply moved by the prince's noble bearing and royal dignity. Mariana nods, satisfied with this fiction, choosing to believe because the alternative is unbearable. She doesn't hear the servants' whispers afterward in corridors and kitchens and stables, doesn't see the foreign ambassadors writing urgent letters home that very night by candlelight. The Spanish heir is gravely compromised. Should succession fall to him, the empire will face immediate crisis. All allies should prepare accordingly. The situation is worse than reported. She only sees what she wants to see her son alive, the future of Spain. Puberty should begin around age 10 for boys. Voices should start to deepen. Bodies should begin the transformation toward adulthood that nature designs. For Carlos José, it brings new problems that compound the existing ones, like debts collecting interest. His body tries to mature, but it's working with broken instructions, with code that doesn't know how to properly execute the complex changes of adolescence. His voice doesn't deepen properly, instead it cracks unpredictably into strange, high-pitched sounds that startle everyone who hears them. Facial hair starts to grow in patchy, uneven spots across his jaw and cheeks. Not the uniform growth of healthy adolescence, but random tufts that make him look unkempt, no matter how carefully servants groom him daily. His skin breaks out in severe eruptions that the court physicians cannot control, despite trying every treatment known to medicine. They try ointments made from crushed pearls imported at ridiculous expense, special diets eliminating various foods one by one, bloodletting to reduce heat in the blood. His face remains a landscape of inflamed bumps and forming scars that will mark him permanently. And he starts having episodes. Nobody knows what triggers them. Sometimes it seems to be stress, too many people in the room, too much noise, too much stimulation. Sometimes fatigue, he hasn't slept well, his body aches, everything is too much. Sometimes nothing visible at all, he'll be sitting quietly and suddenly explode like a powder keg. Tuesday afternoon. A tutor is showing Carlos José a picture book, trying once again to teach him letters. Without warning, the book flies across the room. Carlos José screams, not words, never words, just raw sound that echoes off stone walls and sends servants running. His face turns purple, almost black with blood. His fists clench, his jaw works uselessly, a silver candlestick on the table. He grabs it, throws it with surprising strength. The tutor ducks. The candlestick crashes into the wall, leaving a dent in ancient plaster embedding itself. 3 servants rush in knowing the sound, knowing what it means. It takes all 3 to hold him without causing injury. They have to be so careful because his bones are like glass, prone to breaking under pressure that wouldn't harm a normal person. He fights them for 20 minutes, thrashing, screaming, a wild thing trapped in royal silk. Then collapses like a puppet with cut strings, then weeps, tears running down his scarred face. By evening, he's forgotten it happened, mind unable to hold the memory. The physicians call it melancholy of the blood, or dangerous imbalance of the 4 humors that requires immediate attention, or divine testing of the royal spirit to prepare him for kingship. What they don't have words for, what won't be understood for centuries, is neurological dysfunction caused by genetic abnormalities, brain chemistry gone fundamentally wrong, neural pathways that fire incorrectly or not at all, a mind trapped in patterns it cannot escape or understand or control. By ages 12 through 14, the tutors have long since given up any pretense of traditional education. Instead, they focus on the most basic life skills imaginable, the things toddlers usually master. Can he dress himself? No. His fingers lack the fine motor coordination needed for buttons, laces, clasps, any of it. Can he feed himself? Partially. He can bring soft foods to his mouth with a spoon if someone has prepared everything, but only soft foods, bread soaked in milk-mashed vegetables, thin broths. Anything requiring chewing is beyond him, his jaw too malformed to work properly. Servants must cut everything into tiny pieces because his teeth don't meet, because swallowing is difficult, because choking is always a risk. Can he use the toilet independently? No. He still requires assistance with all bodily functions like an infant, but in the body of an adolescent. At 14 years old, Carlos José functions at roughly the level of a 4-year-old child. Maybe less in some areas, maybe slightly more in others where repetition has created dim understanding, but he's not a child, he's the Crown Prince of Spain, heir to territories spanning 3 continents. Future ruler of millions of people who don't know his name is a joke, and completely, utterly, catastrophically incapable of any of it. The court begins to fracture into competing factions as this reality becomes undeniable, even to the most optimistic. One group led by Queen Mariana with absolute conviction insists Carlos José will improve. He's simply developing slowly. Many great men were slow as children. God's plan works in mysterious ways. We must have faith. We must pray harder. We must believe. They pour resources into him, more physicians brought from across Europe at enormous expense, more prayers and masses, more holy relics pressed against his forehead in hopes of miraculous healing that never comes. Another faction quietly begins exploring alternatives, though they must speak in the most careful euphemisms to avoid charges of treason. Distant cousins who might have claims. Possible regency arrangements where the prince would reign but not rule. Ways to preserve stability when not if, but when it becomes clear that Carlos José cannot truly govern. They speak in whispers and careful phrases. Should His Highness require substantial support in governing? What they mean, this boy will never rule. We need a backup plan before the empire collapses into chaos. But any such discussion is technically treason, punishable by death. So the conversations happen in corners behind closed doors in coded letters that could be burned if discovered. Meanwhile, Europe watches with predatory interest. France under Louis XIV, ambitious and calculating. England recovering from civil war, looking to expand influence. The Dutch Republic, wealthy and ambitious. Austria, the Habsburg heartland, wondering if they should intervene. All of them tracking the health of the Spanish heir with intense attention because everyone understands the truth. When Carlos José eventually becomes king, and he will, because Mariana will accept, no alternative will go to war before allowing displacement. Spain will be vulnerable. A king who can't speak clearly, can't walk without help, can't think strategically, can't command armies, can't negotiate treaties, can't do any of the things kings must do. That's not just a weakness, that's an opportunity. Letters flow between European capitals like water finding cracks. The Habsburg line is failing before our eyes. Spain's power is becoming an illusion maintained through pride alone. When the prince takes the throne, we must be ready to move quickly. Alliances shift in anticipation, military budgets increase, generals study maps of Spain looking for weak points. Europe prepares for the inevitable collapse, but that collapse is still years away. First, there will be a wedding. Because even though Carlos José can barely function as a human being, let alone as a king, even though he has the mind of a small child and the body of a frail old man, even though everyone with eyes can see he's utterly unfit for marriage, let alone producing children, the dynasty demands an heir, the court demands continuity, Spain demands hope, however false, however impossible. And so arrangements are made. A bride is chosen from the dwindling pool of European princesses. Not for love, Carlos José doesn't understand love. Not even for a proper alliance, no major power wants to tie itself to this disaster. Simply for duty, for the appearance of normalcy, for one last, desperate attempt to save a bloodline that should have ended generations ago. Palace of Versailles, France, 1678. Marie-Louise d'Orléans is 17 years old. She's standing in front of a full-length mirror while servants adjust her traveling dress, checking every button and fold with practiced hands. Outside the window, the famous gardens of Versailles stretch in perfect geometric patterns, fountains, dancing in the sunlight, perfectly trimmed topiaries, gravel paths where she's walked since childhood, carefree and happy. This is her home. In 3 days it won't be any more. Because Marie-Louise has just learned she's been chosen to marry the King of Spain, she should feel honored, her mother keeps telling her. Spain is still, at least on maps, at least on paper, one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. The Spanish court glitters with gold from the Americas, with prestige accumulated over centuries of conquest. And she'll be a queen, an actual queen wearing a crown, commanding servants. At 17. But Marie-Louise has also heard the whispers that servants think she doesn't understand about Carlos José, about his health, about the difficulties her uncle King Louis XIV of France summoned her 2 days ago. She'd curtsied low before his throne, heart pounding, wondering what command he would give, what duty he would demand. Marie-Louise? He said, not unkindly, but with the weight of absolute authority that brooks no argument. You understand why this marriage is important. To strengthen the alliance between France and Spain, Your Majesty. Precisely. Spain is weakening, everyone can see it, but a French queen on their throne serves our interests. You will go to Madrid, you will marry their king, and you will provide France with influence in their court. This is not a request. He paused, studying her face with eyes that see everything. The Spanish king is young like yourself, and he has been unwell for most of his life, but you are strong, healthy. You will provide him with heirs, and in doing so, you will serve France. Do you understand your duty? She'd curtsied again, knowing that argument was impossible, that her fate was sealed the moment he decided it. Yes, Your Majesty, I understand. But as she left the throne room, her hands were shaking. Unwell, that's the careful word Louis used, the diplomatic word. But the rumors that circulated through Versailles among the ladies-in-waiting said much worse. Much, much worse. The procession to Spain is magnificent, designed to impress Spanish observers. Carriages gilded and painted with scenes of French glory. armed guards in formation, polished and perfect, wagons loaded with gifts, French wine tapestries, books a dowry fit for a queen. Marie-Louise waves from her carriage window as French crowds cheer her departure, calling blessings. She's trying desperately to be brave, to see this as an adventure rather than an exile, to believe what everyone keeps telling her. But every mile closer to Madrid, every kilometer south towards Spain, her stomach tightens with dread that won't leave. At the border, Spanish officials greet her with elaborate ceremony that takes hours. More carriages, even more ornate than the French ones, dripping with gold leaf. More guards in Spanish livery, red and gold. More protocol, more bowing, more careful speeches about eternal friendship between kingdoms. Everything polished perfect, designed to project power and wealth that may no longer exist. Then finally Madrid. The royal palace looms massive against grey sky stone walls, thick enough to withstand siege towers reaching upward, centuries of history pressing down on everything. Marie-Louise is escorted to her chambers by silent servants. They help her change into formal Spanish court dress, stiff brocade so heavy she can barely move, whalebone stays pressing into her ribs until breathing is difficult. She's powdered, perfumed, arranged like a doll. And then a servant announces in formal tones, His Majesty, King Carlos Jose II of Spain. The door opens. Marie-Louise's first thought, the thought she can never voice aloud. He's a child. Her second thought as her eyes adjust to the dim light, he's my age, 17, but he looks. Carlos Jose enters the room slowly, painfully, slowly. Each step an effort. Two servants walk beside him, hands hovering near his elbows, ready to catch him if he stumbles, which seems likely. His clothes are magnificent velvet, silk, gold embroidery that probably cost a fortune, that probably impoverished some province to create. But his face. The jaw protrudes so far forward that his lips can't meet. Wetness glistens on his lower lip, threatening to drip onto his ornate collar. His eyes slide past her without focusing, without seeming to register her presence at all. He stops a few feet away, swaying slightly, doesn't speak. Just stands there, mouth gaping, breathing audibly through his nose. One of the servants whispers something to him in Spanish words Marie-Louise doesn't catch. Carlos Jose makes a sound, Gah. That might be an attempt at words, but communicates nothing. Marie-Louise, trained since childhood in perfect court etiquette, courtesies deeply, despite the screaming in her mind, despite wanting to run. Your Majesty, she says, voice steady through sheer force of will and years of practice. It is an honor to meet you. Carlos Jose stares at her, or past her. She can't tell which can't tell, if he sees her at all. After a long, horrible silence that stretches like hours, he turns and shuffles out of the room, servants guiding him like a child being led to bed. The door closes. Marie-Louise stands frozen, unable to move, unable to process. That is her husband, the man she's expected to sleep beside every night for the rest of her life. The man who's supposed to father her children, to create heirs for two kingdoms. And from the vacant look in his eyes, she's not even certain he understood who she was or why she was there. The wedding ceremony on November the 19th, 1678, is everything a royal wedding should be, at least in appearance. The chapel filled with Spanish nobility in their finest, clothing jewels worth kingdoms. Bishops in elaborate vestments, heavy with gold thread and pearls. Music echoing off vaulted ceilings, sacred compositions performed by the finest musicians in Spain. Candles everywhere, thousands of them, their flames creating a golden glow that hides imperfections. Marie-Louise wears cloth of gold, a gown so stiff with embroidery and jewels she can barely walk, can barely breathe. Carlos José wears matching gold propped upright by servants cleverly disguised as ceremonial attendants, their supporting hands hidden in his clothing. The bishop reads the vows in Latin that rolls like thunder through the sacred space. Marie-Louise responds clearly, voice carrying through the chapel. I do, Carlos José, makes sounds, vague syllables that might with extraordinary charity and willful blindness be interpreted as agreement. The bishop pretends they're proper vows and continues with the ceremony because what else can he do? Rings are exchanged. Marie-Louise slides a heavy gold ring onto Carlos José's finger with trembling hands. He doesn't react, doesn't look at it, doesn't seem to register what's happening. You may kiss the bride, the bishop intones with ceremonial gravity. Carlos José doesn't move, doesn't understand the instruction. A servant gently pushes his shoulder, physically turning him toward Marie-Louise. Like positioning a statue, she leans in, intending to give him a chaste kiss on the lips as tradition demands. But Carlos José's mouth is open, always open, unable to close and wet with saliva that catches the candlelight. She kisses him quickly, pulling back before the wetness can spread to her face, fighting the urge to wipe her mouth. The chapel erupts in polite applause. Marie-Louise is now Queen of Spain, and she wants to scream, to run, to disappear, to wake up from this nightmare. This is the hardest part of the story to tell with dignity and compassion, because we're speaking of two people trapped in circumstances neither chose, neither deserved. Marie-Louise didn't ask to marry a king whose mind never developed. Carlos José didn't ask to exist in a body that betrayed him constantly. But duty doesn't care about fairness or compassion or human suffering. The newlyweds are led to the royal bedchamber by servants who know exactly what won't happen, who've been told to wait outside but stay close. They're prepared for bed, Marie-Louise in a silk nightgown, Carlos José in bedclothes. Then everyone leaves. The door closes, silence fills the room like water. Contemporary accounts, letters. Marie-Louise wrote secretly to her family in France, smuggled out by sympathetic servants' reports, whispered by servants to court officials. Describe what happened, nothing. Carlos José sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, jaw hanging open. Marie-Louise sat beside him, heart pounding, wondering what she was supposed to do, how this was supposed to work. Minutes passed, like hours. She tried speaking, "Your Majesty." Response. No acknowledgement she'd spoken. She tried gently touching his hand. He flinched away as if burned, making a frightened sound. Hours crawled by in terrible silence. The candles burned lower. Eventually, Carlos José lay down and fell asleep, wetness soaking into the pillow. Marie-Louise lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, wondering how this would possibly produce the heirs everyone expected, everyone demanded. The entire Spanish court waits for pregnancy news. Months pass, no announcement comes. Queen Mother Mariana begins to worry, then to panic. She summons Marie-Louise for a private audience in her chambers. "Your Majesty," Mariana says, carefully voiced tight, with controlled fear. "Have you and the king fulfilled your marital duties?" Marie-Louise's face burns with shame. "The king does not seem to understand what is expected, Your Majesty." Mariana's expression hardens like stone, jaw clenching. "Then you must guide him, instruct him, show him what must be done. "I have tried, Your Majesty," but he does not respond to any intimacy. He seems confused by it, frightened even. He pulls away. Silence stretches between them, heavy with implications. Mariana dismisses her with a wave, but the pressure intensifies dramatically over the following weeks. Royal physicians are brought in for examinations that humiliate everyone involved. They examine Carlos José in private, emerging with troubled faces and careful words. They examine Marie-Louise, finding nothing wrong with her. They prescribe desperate measures, for him aphrodisiacs from across the empire. Powdered rhinoceros horn imported at great expense from distant lands. Ground pearls, raw oysters, all the supposed virility enhancers known to medicine and superstition. For her, prayers to specific saints known for fertility, herbs to encourage conception, sleeping positions supposedly favorable for pregnancy drawn from ancient texts. None of it works, because the problem isn't medical in any way they can treat. It's that Carlos José genuinely doesn't understand sex, cannot grasp the concept with his childlike mind. And even if he could understand, his body might not be capable of the act. Marie-Louise stops trying after the first year of futile, humiliating attempts. What's the point of this torture? Instead, she retreats into her own shrinking world. She spends hours in the palace gardens, the only place that reminds her of Versailles, of home, of happiness that feels like it belonged to someone else. She writes desperate letters to France that become increasingly plaintive. "Uncle, please, can I come home, even for a visit, even for a few weeks? I am dying here slowly. I cannot bear this existence much longer." Louis XIV writes back with cold political logic that offers no comfort. "You are Queen of Spain. Your duty is there. France needs this alliance. You cannot abandon your post. Endure." So she stays because she has no choice. Trapped. Watching Carlos José shuffle through hallways, wetness running down his chin, constantly leaving trails on his expensive clothes, enduring dinners where he struggles to eat food falling from his mouth onto the table, servants rushing to clean up, sitting through endless ceremonies where he's propped upright, like a decorated corpse, while ministers pretend to consult him on matters he cannot possibly comprehend. She's 27 years old. She looks 50. Her health deteriorates from stress and hopelessness and the slow death of the spirit. The joy drains from her eyes completely, replaced by something hollow. Court observers note she's stopped eating properly, picking at meals, growing thinner. The Queen seems melancholy. They whisper with concern but do nothing. But it's deeper than melancholy. It's despair so profound, it's killing her cell by cell. February 12th, 1689. Marie-Louise wakes before dawn, feeling ill. Stomach pain, nausea that won't pass. She dismisses it initially. She's often sick these days, from stress, from unhappiness that manifests physically. But the pain gets worse throughout the day, sharp and getting sharper. By evening, she's doubled over in her chambers, crying out despite trying to maintain dignity. Physicians rush to her rooms with their bags of useless tools. They try their standard treatments, bloodletting to release bad humors, herbal remedies that taste like poison, prayers muttered over her writhing form. Nothing helps. The pain intensifies beyond anything she's ever felt. Within hours, her condition deteriorates catastrophically. Her skin turns gray like ash. She begins vomiting violently, uncontrollably, bringing up everything in her stomach, and then bile. By midnight, she's barely conscious, drifting in and out. At dawn on February 13th, Marie-Louise d'Orléans, Queen of Spain, aged 27, dies. The official cause recorded in palace documents: intestinal blockage. Some historians studying the period suspect poison palace intrigue, political enemies, plots within plots. Others believe it was appendicitis or peritonitis, both deadly in an age without antibiotics, or surgical intervention when cutting open the body meant certain death. But maybe, just maybe, it was something simpler and sadder. Maybe it was grief. 10 years of hopelessness, 10 years trapped in a nightmare with no exit. 10 years sleeping beside a husband who couldn't understand her, couldn't speak to her, couldn't provide even basic companionship or kindness. And her body simply gave up, stopped fighting, chose death over one more day. Carlos Jose is brought to view her body by servants who think maybe somehow it will mean something to him. They guide him into the chamber where she lies in state, dressed in white hands, folded across her chest, face peaceful at last, finally free. He stares at her for a long moment. Then, to everyone's shock, he begins to wail. Not words, he's never spoken words in his life, but raw, wounded sounds that come from somewhere deep. He drops to his knees beside the bed with a heavy thud that makes servants wince, reaches for her cold hand with his trembling one holding it. Is he mourning? Does some part of his damaged brain understand loss, understand that she's gone forever? Or is this just confusion, another person gone from his limited world, another disruption to his routine? No one knows. No one will ever know. They let him cry for several minutes, the sound echoing through the stone chamber. Then servants gently pull him away because the display is unseemly for a king, because there are protocols, even for grief. He'll forget within days, memory unable to hold on to anything for long. His mind can't hold on to grief any more than it can hold on to joy or understanding or hope. But Marie-Louise is dead. 10 years of marriage. No children, no heir, no hope. Spain's future remains as broken as its king. And in courts across Europe, letters circulate with renewed urgency. The Spanish king's wife has died childless. The dynasty is failing visibly. All nations should prepare for war over the succession. This cannot last much longer. Madrid, 1689. Queen Mother Mariana is 60 years old, face lined with worry and determination that's hardened into something like madness. Her son, King Carlos Jose, is 28. He's just been widowed, and she has one thought, one singular obsession that consumes every waking moment. He must remarry. He must try again, because without an heir, everything falls apart. The Spanish throne, the territories in Italy, the Netherlands, the vast holdings in the Americas, all of it becomes contested the moment Carlos Jose dies without a son. And he will die. Everyone knows it, though no one says it in her presence. His health deteriorates monthly, sometimes weekly, sometimes daily. So Mariana begins the search for a new bride with urgent desperation that borders on panic. The requirements: young childbearing age, preferably early 20s or younger, someone who can endure multiple pregnancies, healthy, strong enough to survive childbirth repeatedly. Royal bloodline still matters even now, even after everything. Desperate enough to accept this is the hardest requirement. Because by 1689, everyone in Europe knows about Carlos Jose. The portraits lie showing a dignified if stern-looking monarch with careful lighting. But the letters from ambassadors tell the truth in coded language that everyone understands. The Spanish king cannot walk unassisted. His speech is incomprehensible sounds without meaning. His mind is that of a small child. He will never father children. Any princess sent to him faces a life of isolation and despair. We cannot recommend this match. What family would willingly send their daughter into this prison? The choice falls on Maria Anna of Pfalz-Neuburg. She's 26 years old, German, Catholic, from a noble but financially struggling family that sees opportunity in disaster. When the proposal arrives, Queen of Spain, a crown status, her family sees only the title, not the curse attached. Never mind the warnings from those who know. Never mind the rumors that circulate. This is royalty. This is power. This is their chance to rise. Maria Anna doesn't want to go. She's heard the stories. She knows what awaits. But in 1689, noble daughters don't get to choose their husbands or their fates or their futures. The second wedding on May 4th, 1690, is less elaborate than the first. Spain can't afford extravagance anymore. The treasury is nearly empty, drained by wars and debt and decades of mismanagement. But there are still protocols to observe, appearances to maintain, even if the gold is gilt. Maria Anna arrives in Madrid, pale and silent, knowing what awaits, having no illusions. She's shown to Carlos Jose in a private audience. He barely reacts to her presence, just stares with that vacant look she's heard about, jaw gaping, wetness dripping. At the ceremony, she says her vows clearly and firmly, voice not trembling. He makes sounds the priest interprets charitably as consent, as agreement, as vows. And Spain has a new queen. But Maria Anna quickly discovers what Marie-Louise learned through bitter experience. There will be no children. Carlos Jose's body, already failing in so many ways, is now beyond even the pretense of virility, beyond even the possibility. The physicians examine him in private, their conclusion written in the most careful medical euphemisms for the official record. His Majesty's anatomy shows signs of severe underdevelopment. Natural conception appears impossible. We recommend prayers and holy intervention. In modern terms, Carlos Jose is effectively sterile. The genetic catastrophe that created him also rendered him unable to pass on those genes. Nature's emergency brake, preventing further disaster. Carlos Jose's physical decline accelerates like a cart rolling downhill without brakes. His legs can no longer support even his minimal weight. He's carried everywhere now in a special chair by 4 strong servants who've been hired specifically for this task. His digestion fails almost completely. He can only consume thin broths, soft breads soaked in milk until they dissolve, mashed foods without any texture. Even then he chokes frequently, requiring servants to pound his back while he gasps and sputters. His skin develops sores that won't heal, weeping fluid, constantly bandages changed hourly. His bones are so brittle that the slightest pressure leaves dark bruises that take weeks to fade, if they fade at all. He has seizures, violent convulsions that leave him unconscious for hours, then confused and terrified when he wakes, not knowing where he is. And his mind, never strong, retreats further from whatever dim awareness it once had. He stops recognizing people entirely, even those he sees daily. Some days he asks for his mother, meaning Mariana, who died in 1696. Other days he calls for Mama in a childlike voice, lost and frightened, wanting comfort no one can provide. He weeps often without apparent cause, random wordless crying that lasts for hours. No one knows why. Pain, fear, confusion, loneliness, the weight of existence in a broken body. He cannot tell them. He cannot tell them anything. The court continues its charade because stopping would mean admitting total failure. Every morning, the same ritual that everyone knows is meaningless. Servants dress him in royal clothes that cost fortunes. Carry him to the throne room, his body light as a child's. Position him carefully on the throne, arranging him like furniture. Ministers report to him as if he understands policy, as if his opinion matters. Your Majesty, regarding the war with France and our diplomatic position. Carlos José stares at nothing wetness, running down the velvet at his throat, soaking into expensive fabric. "We shall take that as approval, Your Majesty. This is government now. A puppet king, a shadow throne, an empire pretending. While real power is fought over by competing factions, ministers, bishops, foreign ambassadors, all maneuvering to control Spain after Carlos José inevitably dies. Because he will die soon. Anyone with eyes can see it. Anyone honest enough to look. By 1699, at age 38, Carlos José weighs barely 88 pounds. His body is skeletal bones visible through translucent skin, every rib countable. He can no longer control his bodily functions at all. Servants change him like an infant, multiple times daily, trying to maintain some shred of dignity for a king who has none left. His eyes, clouded by growths, can barely see. His breathing is labored, wet, rattling sounds that never stop day or night. He sleeps most of each day now, drifting in and out. When awake, he's often delirious, speaking to people who aren't there, reaching for things that don't exist, living in some other reality only he can perceive, perhaps more merciful than this one. The physicians stop pretending they can help. They just try to keep him comfortable in his final decline, to ease his passage, which in 1699 means laudanum for pain when he seems distressed, administered by drops. Servants to turn him frequently so he doesn't develop worse bed sores than he already has. Cool cloths when fever spikes. That's all medical science can offer. That's all anyone can do. And across Europe, the vultures circle closer, sharpening their beaks. France sends ambassadors with carefully worded proposals. When His Majesty passes, which God forbid, surely the throne should pass to a Bourbon prince with strong French ties. Austria sends counter-proposals. The Habsburg line must continue through the Austrian branch. We are family. This is our right. England and the Dutch Republic watch nervously, terrified. Either option will create a superpower that dominates Europe. They all talk around. The obvious Carlos José is dying. And when he does, Spain, still one of the richest empires on earth despite its problems, will be the greatest prize in a continental war. But Carlos José, in his clouded, confused mind, understands none of this political maneuvering, none of these calculations. He exists in a fog of pain and confusion. Sometimes a servant's face swims into focus for a moment. Sometimes he hears music and doesn't know where it comes from. Mostly, he just drifts, waiting for something he can't name or comprehend. An end to suffering he lacks the mental capacity to understand. Madrid, October 1700. Carlos José has been dying for 39 years, but now finally the end is close enough to smell. The palace smells of it, incense burning constantly to mask the odor of decay, of a body shutting down piece by piece of flesh that's given up the fight. The king's chambers have become a death watch. Priests rotate in shifts, murmuring prayers in Latin that blend together into a constant low hum. Physicians check his pulse every hour, noting the weakening beat in leather-bound journals. Servants move like ghosts, speaking in whispers, afraid that normal voices might somehow hasten what's already inevitable. Carlos José lies in his massive bed, propped on pillows to help him breathe. He weighs less than 90 pounds now. His skin has taken on a yellowish tinge like old parchment left too long in sunlight. His breathing sounds like wet paper tearing. But the empire cannot die with him. Not officially, not without a plan. And so in a room down the hall, the real drama unfolds. A dozen men crowd around a table covered in documents, maps, genealogies, proposed wills, letters from foreign courts. These are the men who actually run Spain, ministers, bishops, advisors, who've been making decisions in Carlos José's name for decades. And they're arguing. The will must name Philip of Anjou, insists one faction, backed by French gold and promises, Louis XIV's grandson. It's the only way to prevent the empire from fracturing into pieces. Unacceptable counters another group, their faces red with indignation. That puts a French prince on the Spanish throne. Austria must inherit. Archduke Charles. Keep it in the family where it belongs. The family. Someone laughs bitterly, the sound harsh in the candlelit room. The family is what created this disaster in the first place. Silence falls. Because everyone in the room knows it's true. They've watched Carlos José deteriorate for decades. They've seen the portraits of his ancestors, the progression of that jaw, the narrowing of the bloodline like a noose tightening. They know exactly what the family did to itself. But saying it aloud still feels like blasphemy, like admitting the entire system was built on sand. The debate continues for hours, then days, then weeks. Meanwhile, in his bed, Carlos José drifts. Sometimes he wakes eyes opening to stare at the ceiling, painted with scenes of heaven angels and clouds and God on his throne, looking down with judgment or mercy, impossible to tell which. Sometimes he makes sounds, wordless moans that might be pain or confusion, or simply the noise of a body, failing systems shutting down one by one. Sometimes servants think he's gone breath so shallow they can't detect it, until suddenly he gasps and continues, chest rising and falling with effort that looks exhausting. He cannot speak, cannot communicate, cannot express any preference about who should inherit the empire he never ruled, never understood, never even comprehended. But a will must be written in his name, because that's how succession works, how legitimacy is established, how wars might possibly be avoided if everyone agrees to respect the dying king's wishes. And so they bring him documents. A priest reads aloud in Spanish slowly, as if Carlos José can understand the words that wash over him like meaningless sound. Your Majesty, this document names Philip of Anjou as your heir to inherit all Spanish territories and crowns. Do you consent to this arrangement? Carlos José stares at the ceiling at the painted angels. Does he see them? Does he see anything at all? They place a quill in his hand. His fingers are so thin now, just bone wrapped in translucent skin. They guide his hand across parchment, helping him make a mark that might, if you're very charitable, if you squint and want desperately to believe, resemble a signature. More like a child's scribble, more like random lines. But it's there, in ink, witnessed by bishops and nobles. There the priest says, satisfaction in his voice, masking deeper anxiety. His Majesty has spoken. His will is clear. It's a lie, of course, the most elaborate lie in a lifetime of lies. Carlos José hasn't spoken in his entire life. Not really just sounds, just noise. This decision was made by factions and politics and French gold-changing hands in dark corners. But the will is legal, signed, witnessed by men of God and nobility. Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, is now heir to the Spanish Empire. The French faction celebrates quietly, carefully behind closed doors. The Austrian faction begins writing urgent letters sealed with red wax, informing Vienna that France has stolen what should be theirs, that this cannot stand. And across Europe, from London to Vienna to Amsterdam, generals begin reviewing maps, checking supply lines, calculating how long it would take to mobilize armies, sharpening swords that haven't been used in years. Because everyone knows what this means. War. Not immediately, not while Carlos José still draws breath, but soon, very soon. The waiting becomes unbearable for everyone except Carlos José, who doesn't understand waiting or time or anything beyond the immediate sensation of existing in a body that hurts. Every morning servants enter his chambers expecting to find him dead. Every morning, somehow, impossibly, he's still breathing. It's as if his body has forgotten how to die, as if 3 decades of barely living has trained it to continue out of pure habit, muscle memory, biological momentum. Days stretch into weeks. October becomes November, the weather turns cold. Rain lashes the palace windows, wind howling through stone corridors. Winter approaches Madrid with its usual cruelty, and still Carlos José hangs on. Queen Maria Anna sits by his bedside sometimes, though she feels nothing for him beyond abstract pity. How could she feel anything else? He's been more burden than husband, more duty than person, more symbol than human being. But she sits because it's expected, because queens perform their roles until the curtain finally falls. She watches his chest rise and fall, each breath a struggle, each exhale sounding like it might be the last. And she wonders what he sees in those moments when his eyes are open, clouded, and unfocused. Does he see anything at all? Does some part of him understand what's happening, that he's dying, that the empire is dying with him? Or is there nothing left inside but the basic functions of a body too stubborn to quit? A servant enters with a tray bearing a bowl of broth, though Carlos José hasn't eaten anything substantial in days, maybe weeks. They try anyway, because that's what servants do. They follow routine, they maintain pretense, they perform duty. They lift his head gently, supporting his skull with practiced hands. They bring a spoon to his lips parted, as always, never meeting. The liquid touches his mouth and immediately runs down his chin across his neck, soaking into the bedclothes. His throat doesn't work anymore. The muscles have forgotten how to swallow, how to coordinate the complex series of actions that move food from mouth to stomach. They lay him back down, gently, carefully, as if he's made of glass. His breathing changes, becomes more labored, more irregular, pauses stretching longer between each breath. A physician checks his pulse, fingers pressed against Carlos José's wrist, where veins show blue through skin like paper. Not long now, he murmurs to the priest standing nearby, voice so low, only the two of them can hear. The priest nods and begins the prayers for the dying, the sacred words in Latin that are supposed to ease the soul's passage from this world to the next. In manus tuas Domine commendo spiritum meum. Into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit. Outside the palace, Madrid goes about its business with the usual chaos of city life. Markets open at dawn, vendors calling their wares fresh bread oil, wine, fish brought from the coast. Taverns fill with workers seeking warmth and cheap alcohol. Children play in streets that smell of cooking fires and horse manure and humanity pressed together. Most people have forgotten they even have a king, or if they remember, they don't think about him. Spain has been running without him for so long that his death will barely register, except as an excuse for a day of official mourning, for black banners hung from balconies, for churches to hold special masses. Life will continue, it always does, but in courts across Europe, ambassadors wait by their windows watching for riders, watching for the signal, watching for the moment when everything changes. In Vienna, Archduke Charles is already being fitted for crowns and rehearsing the bearing of a king. Austrian advisors, certain the throne will be theirs, despite what the will says, despite French gold and signatures. In Versailles, Philip of Anjou practices Spanish phrases with tutors who correct his pronunciation, learning protocols of the Spanish court, preparing to claim what the will has promised him. In London and Amsterdam, diplomats draft emergency treaties preparing for the war that will reshape Europe, whether anyone wants it or not. Everyone is ready. Everyone has been ready for years. Everyone except Carlos José, who has never been ready for anything, who was never capable of readiness or preparation or understanding. He simply exists in his bed chest, rising and falling each breath a little weaker than the last, waiting for a body to finally do what minds cannot force it to, waiting for nature to finish what it started 39 years ago in a stone chamber while midwives whispered prayers and queens screamed. The invoice is almost paid, the debt almost settled, the final Habsburg is dying. And when he goes, he'll take an empire with him into the grave. November 1st, 1700. Dawn breaks cold over Madrid, pale light filtering through clouds heavy with rain. In the palace, nothing has changed, except that everything is about to. Carlos José's breathing has become increasingly irregular through the night, long pauses where his chest doesn't move at all, where everyone thinks this is it, followed by sudden gasps that sound like surprise, like his body forgot it needed air and suddenly remembered. The physicians have stopped pretending there's anything they can do beyond witness and record. They've administered last rites 3 times now, only to have him continue breathing afterward, confounding everyone who thought they understood death. His Majesty's will to live is extraordinary, one doctor says to another, though they both know it's not will, it's just biology, muscle memory, a body that doesn't know when to stop because the mind that should tell it has been absent for decades. Queen Maria Anna hasn't left her chambers in 2 days. There's no point sitting vigil anymore, no point in the performance. She's done her duty. Married him, tried to produce an heir through sheer force of will and prayer. Failed, through no fault of her own, through the simple reality that Carlos José's body couldn't do what empires demanded. Now she waits for release like everyone else for the moment when she can stop being Queen of Spain and become simply Maria Anna again, free to return to Germany, to leave this nightmare behind. In the throne room, ministers have stopped even pretending to govern. They sit in small groups, speaking in low voices, making plans for afterward. Factions have formed, hardened, prepared themselves for the struggle to come. Some will support the French claim Philip of Anjou, named in the will that may or may not be legitimate depending on who you ask. Others will resist, calling for the Austrian candidate, despite what the documents say, despite signatures and seals and witnesses. A few wonder if Spain might simply fracture different territories, going their separate ways, the empire dissolving like morning mist under sun. But first, the king must die. And Carlos José, who has never done anything on schedule, who has never met a single expectation in his life, takes his time, even with this final act. November 1st passes in anxious waiting. Then November 2nd, candles burning, low prayers continuing in endless rotation. The death watch continues with priests whose voices go hoarse and are replaced by fresh priests who continue the cycle. Candles burn down to stubs and are replaced by servants moving silently. The smell of incense grows so thick it makes people's eyes water, makes them cough. And still, somehow, impossibly, Carlos José breathes. On the morning of November the 3rd, something changes in the room's atmosphere. A servant checking on the king notices his eyes are open, not staring blankly like usual, unfocused and seeing nothing, but focused on something above him, the ceiling perhaps with its painted scenes of heaven, or something beyond it that no one else can see, something only visible to those standing at the threshold between worlds. His lips move slightly, forming shapes without sound. No voice comes out. His voice has been gone for weeks, months, maybe, the exact timeline lost in the blur of gradual decline. But his lips form shapes that might be words, might be prayers, might be nothing at all, might be everything. Is he trying to speak after 39 years of silence, of sounds without meaning? Is there something he wants to say? The servant leans closer, trying to hear, trying to understand, desperate for some final message. But there's only breathing, wet, labored, each inhale taking longer to come, each exhale lasting longer. The servant runs for the priest, footsteps echoing through stone corridors. By the time they return, Carlos José's eyes have closed again. But something has shifted in his face, a quality impossible to name, but unmistakable to those who've attended many deaths. The jaw, always twisted, always protruding, seems different somehow. Peaceful almost, if such a cursed feature can ever look peaceful. As if some long struggle has finally ended, as if he's stopped fighting something he never understood in the first place. His breathing slows. Each exhale takes longer to follow each inhale. The pauses stretch. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The priest begins the final prayers, voice steady, despite years of practice not preparing him for this moment, for the end of a dynasty that has ruled for 2 centuries. In manus tuas domine commendo spiritum meum. Everyone in the room knows what's happening. This is it, the actual end, after all the false alarms, all the near deaths, all the times they thought he was gone. Only to have him gasp back to life this time is different. They can feel it in the air, taste it like copper on their tongues. A breath. A long pause that seems to last forever. Another breath, barely perceptible, barely moving his chest. Another pause, longer still. The priest's voice fills the silence. Requiem aeternam, dona e Domine. Grant him eternal rest, O Lord. One more breath. So faint it barely disturbs the air, barely registers as movement. Then nothing. The room holds its collective breath, waiting, not quite believing. 10 seconds. 20. 30. A full minute passes in absolute silence. The physician steps forward, places his fingers on Carlos José's neck, feeling for a pulse that isn't there. Nothing. No beat, no flutter, no sign of life. He holds a small mirror to the king's lips, checking for breath. The glass remains perfectly clear. No fog, no condensation. He looks at the priest and nods once slowly. It's over. King Carlos José II of Spain is dead. The priest crosses himself, then closes the king's eyes with gentle fingers, pulling the lids down over those clouded pupils that saw so little of this world. For a moment no one moves, no one speaks. They simply stand in the presence of what this means, the weight of it settling on their shoulders like physical burden. An empire without an emperor. A throne without an heir. 200 years of Habsburg rule in Spain, ending in this cold room with a body that weighs less than a child, that never produced children, that was itself the final product of a strategy gone catastrophically wrong. Then, as if released from a spell, everyone moves at once. A servant runs to inform Queen Maria Anna, footsteps echoing. Another rushes to the ministers waiting in the throne room, the news they've been expecting but dreading. The physician begins noting the exact time of death in his journal, just before sunrise on November the 3rd, 1700, recording it with careful precision for history to remember. The priest continues his prayers, though the soul he's praying for has either already fled or was never quite there to begin with, depending on your theology and your willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And in the bed, Carlos José lies still for the first time in his life. No more struggling to breathe through malformed airways, no more choking on his own saliva that flowed constantly, no more confusion, no more pain, no more existing in a body that was never meant to exist, in a mind that never developed, in a life that never should have been lived. just silence, just stillness, just the end of suffering that should never have begun. Within an hour, the news spread through the palace like fire, through dry grass servants, whispering nobles gathering in clusters. Within 2 hours, riders are racing from Madrid to every corner of Europe, carrying the message that will change everything, horses galloping through dawn light. Within a day, church bells across Spain ring in mourning not for a king anyone loved or even knew, but for the idea of continuity, for the illusion that things could stay the same forever. Within a week, armies will begin to move, because Carlos José's death is not an ending, it's a starting gun. Before they can bury him, before they can seal him in a tomb and try to forget, the physicians insist on an autopsy. For the medical records, they say, with professional gravity. To understand what took His Majesty from us, they claim, with false piety. But really they want to know. After watching this wreck of a human being struggle through 39 years of life, after witnessing the gradual failure of every system in his body, they want to understand what was actually wrong. What could create such profound dysfunction? What the portraits and careful words tried to hide. The autopsy takes place in a cold stone chamber deep in the palace, far from where courtiers might hear or smell what's happening. 4 physicians gather around the table where Carlos José's body lies naked and pathetic in death as it was in life. They've performed autopsies before on nobles, on bishops, on others who died mysteriously and needed examination to rule out poison or foul play. But this is different. This is a king. This is history itself lying on their table. They begin with prayers, crossing themselves, asking God's forgiveness for what they're about to do to a consecrated body. Then the lead physician makes the first incision with a blade sharp enough to cut through skin like butter. And even these men, used to the sights and smells of death, hardened by years of medical practice, pause. Because what they find inside is worse than they imagined, worse than their darkest suspicions. The heart is shriveled, barely the size of a child's, blackened in places where tissue has died, and never regenerated chambers malformed. How did this pump blood for 39 years? One physician whispers genuine awe in his voice. The lungs are filled with fluid, corroded, barely functional scarred tissue and pockets of infection that should have killed him years ago. It's a miracle he could breathe at all, another says, shaking his head. The liver is spotted with disease, failing long before death arrived, mottled yellow and brown. The intestines are in such poor condition that one physician mutters, "How did he process any food? These are rotting. While he lived, the kidneys are malformed, undersized, doing perhaps a quarter of what healthy kidneys should do. The reproductive organs are, as one doctor writes carefully in his notes with euphemisms, completely undeveloped, incapable of function, resembling those of a prepubescent child, sterile, always had been, always would have been. No amount of prayer or herbs or political pressure could have changed it. But it's the skull that shocks them most. When they open it carefully with saw and chisel, they find it partially filled with fluid where brain tissue should be. The brain itself is smaller than it should be, withered with visible abnormalities that even their limited understanding of anatomy recognizes as catastrophically wrong. Sections that should be developed are barely there. Neural tissue that should connect different regions is absent or malformed. One physician, the eldest, who has studied at the finest universities of Europe at Salamanca and Bologna and Paris, stares at what he's seeing and understands something his colleagues don't yet grasp. This wasn't just illness accumulated over a lifetime. This wasn't bad luck or divine punishment or witchcraft. This was something built into Carlos José from the moment of conception, written into his very being before he took his first breath. Something inherited, something passed down. He writes in his report in careful Latin so the common people cannot read it, so the truth can be hidden in educated language, cor parvum. Pulmones putrefacti, intestina gangrenosa, testiculi atrophici, cerebrum aqua plenum, heart small, lungs rotted, intestines gangrenous, testicles atrophied, brain filled with water. Then, in a separate section that will be sealed and stored away from prying eyes. It is the opinion of this physician that His Majesty's condition was not acquired through disease or misfortune, but was present from birth, inherited from ancestry in ways we do not fully comprehend. The body contained not a single organ without severe defect. That life persisted for 39 years defies natural understanding. It's the closest anyone in 1700 will come to understanding genetics, to grasping what the family did to itself. The closest they'll come to realizing that Carlos Jose was not a victim of witchcraft or divine displeasure, but of human choices repeated across generations until nature could no longer compensate. They catalogue everything methodically, professionally, with the detachment of scientists recording data. Every malformation listed in precise Latin. Every organ that failed to develop properly measured and described. Every system that barely functioned documented for posterity. The report runs to 15 pages, when finished pages filled with clinical observations and measurements. It will be sealed, stored in the Royal Archives, locked away in darkness, not to be read again for centuries, because the truth it contains is too dangerous, too damning, too threatening to the entire social order. It suggests that the royal family, the divine right monarchs chosen by God Himself to rule over millions, could be flawed in their very blood. It suggests that all the careful marriage planning, all the obsession with purity, all the turning inward to keep the bloodline strong actually made it weak, made it sick, made it monstrous. And that cannot be spoken aloud, not in 1700, not when the entire political system depends on the idea that royal blood is special, sacred, superior to common blood. So the report is sealed with red wax, bearing the royal crest. The physicians are sworn to secrecy on their immortal souls on pain of excommunication. And Carlos Jose's body is prepared for burial with all the ceremony due a king, regardless of what lies beneath the royal robes in expensive silk. They dress him in elaborate clothing, velvet and silk, and cloth of gold layers of expensive fabric, hiding the skeletal frame. They place the crown on his head one final time, though it sits awkwardly because of the shape of his skull, because his head was never meant to bear crowns. They arrange his hands across his chest in the position of prayer, holding a golden crucifix encrusted with rubies. They make him look from a distance through candlelight and incense smoke like a king resting in state with dignity. But up close, even death cannot hide what he was. The jaw still protrudes grotesquely, even in death, refusing to conform. The skin is still yellowish, waxen like cheap candles. The body is still that of someone who never should have been born, let alone crowned, let alone expected to rule an empire. The viewing is brief and carefully controlled. Maria Anna comes, pays her respects with dry eyes and a face like stone, and leaves without a word. A few ministers file past, bowing to the corpse out of habit, more than respect or grief. No crowds of mourning subjects. The public is kept away, supposedly out of reverence for royal privacy, actually, because seeing him might raise uncomfortable questions that have no good answers. Within 2 days, he's sealed in a lead coffin, locked away from sight forever. Within 3, he's interred in the royal crypt at El Escorial, the massive monastery palace built by his great-great-grandfather Felipe II, placed among his ancestors in the cool darkness beneath marble floors in vaults, designed to hold dynasties, the same ancestors whose choices created him, the same ancestors who married their cousins, their nieces, their own bloodline again and again, thinking they were preserving something precious. If bodies could speak from their tombs, if the dead could converse in darkness, what would they say to each other? Would his great-grandmother Juana Mad Juana, locked away for decades, talking to corpses, recognize his suffering as an echo of her own madness? Would his grandfather, Felipe IV, feel guilt for marrying his niece, Mariana, for creating the circumstances that led directly to this? Would his great-grandfather, Felipe III, understand that his cousin marriages contributed to the pattern? Would any of them accept responsibility for what they'd done? Or would they still insist it was God's will, divine right, the necessary price of keeping power in the family, the only way to maintain purity? The tomb is sealed with stone and mortar. The prayers are said in Latin that echoes off vaulted ceilings. The monks of El Escorial return to their routines of prayer and silence, and Carlos Jose, who barely lived, finally rests. But his death is not the end of the story. It's barely the beginning of the consequences. The messengers reach Paris, first horses lathered and exhausted from days of riding. A rider, mud-splattered and barely able to stand, arrives at Versailles just after dawn, 3 days after Carlos José's death. He's rushed to King Louis XIV's chambers despite the early hour, despite protocols about disturbing the king before his formal rising. The message is brief, written in code that everyone understands. The Spanish king is dead. Your grandson is named heir in the will. Louis XIV, 72 years old, the Sun King who has ruled France for nearly 60 years, who has spent decades positioning himself for exactly this moment, allows himself a smile. Not a large smile. He's too controlled, too conscious of his image, too aware that servants are watching. But a smile nonetheless. He's been waiting for this news, planning for it, investing French gold and French diplomacy in making sure the will would name his grandson. And now it's happened. His grandson Philip, currently Duke of Anjou, a boy of 17 with French education and French loyalties, is about to become Philip V of Spain. France and Spain united under the Bourbon family, the greatest power Europe has ever seen, a superpower that would dwarf any rival. Gentleman Louis announces to his advisors that morning, standing before them in his private chambers, with satisfaction radiating from every pore, there are no more Pyrenees. The mountain range that separates France and Spain, it might as well not exist anymore, he means. The two kingdoms are effectively one. The balance of power in Europe has just shifted dramatically in France's favor. But in Vienna, a different message arrives, and the reaction is fury. Archduke Charles reads the dispatch with hands that tremble, not from age but from rage barely controlled. His advisors huddle around him in the Hofburg Palace, indignant, outraged, already planning responses. The will is invalid, they insist, voices rising. Carlos José was mentally incompetent his entire life. He couldn't have made this decision. The signatures are forgeries or forced. The throne belongs to you, to the Austrian Habsburgs, who are the legitimate branch of the family. Charles, younger and less experienced than Louis, more hesitant by nature, nods slowly. He didn't particularly want to be king of Spain, didn't seek this burden. But his family has ruled there for 200 years, since Carlos V united the Spanish and Austrian branches. Letting it go to France is unthinkable, an insult to Habsburg honor and Austrian interests. Prepare our claim, he says quietly. Make it clear we will not accept this French theft. In London, King William III receives the news with the cold calculation of a man who understands exactly what's about to happen. He doesn't care personally who sits on the Spanish throne. Spanish politics are Spain's problem. But he cares very much about the balance of power in Europe, about preventing any single nation from becoming too dominant. And a Franco-Spanish superpower, under Louis XIV, is a direct threat to everything, to English trade, to Dutch independence, to the careful equilibrium that keeps Europe from constant warfare. Within days, he's meeting with Dutch representatives in private chambers. Within weeks, a coalition is forming like storm clouds gathering. England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, several German states, Portugal, all united by one goal: prevent France from controlling Spain, prevent the Bourbon dynasty from becoming unstoppable, preserve the balance whatever the cost. But Louis has already moved, striking while his opponents are still organizing. French troops are marching toward the Spanish Netherlands, moving to secure the territories before anyone can contest them. Philip of Anjou is preparing to leave for Madrid to claim his throne, surrounded by French advisors who will whisper in his ear. And in Spain itself, chaos erupts like a wound bursting open. Some nobles support Philip. He's the legal heir according to the will, and challenging the king's dying wishes seems wrong. Others refuse to accept a French king. Better to fight than submit to France, than become a French puppet. The country splits along regional lines that have been papered over for centuries. Catalonia declares for Archduke Charles, the Austrian candidate. Castile supports Philip, the French candidate. Both sides begin arming, raising militias, preparing for conflict. Civil war brews like a storm about to break. By spring of 1701, Europe is mobilizing for war, armies assembling, supplies being gathered. By summer, the first battles are fought, minor skirmishes that test resolve and preparation. By autumn, the continent is fully at war, in a conflict that will reshape everything. They'll call it the War of the Spanish Succession. It will last 13 years. 13 brutal years that will devastate Europe, from Spain to the Netherlands to Germany to Italy. 13 years of battlefields across the continent, of cities besieged, of villages burned, of farmland destroyed, of populations displaced. 13 years of soldiers dying in muddy fields, in trenches, in hospitals filled with screaming wounded. Some of the most famous battles in European history will be fought during this war. Blenheim in 1704, where the Duke of Marlborough crushes French forces and shatters Louis XIV's aura of invincibility. Ramillies in 1706, another devastating French defeat. Oudenarde in 1708, Malplaquet in 1709, a bloodbath that kills over 30,000 men in a single day and leaves both sides traumatized. The names will echo through military academies for centuries, studied by generals trying to understand tactics and strategy. But behind each famous battle are thousands of individual tragedies that history forgets. Hundreds of thousands will die before the war ends. Maybe more exact counts are impossible, when entire regions are devastated, when records are destroyed, when bodies are left unburied in mass graves. Soldiers, yes, professional soldiers fighting for kings they've never met over causes they don't understand, but also civilians, always civilians, farmers whose crops are burned by passing armies, who starve through winters without food, townsfolk whose cities are besieged for months, eating rats and leather before surrendering, women and children caught in the crossfire, displaced refugees wandering roads looking for safety that doesn't exist. And it's all because Carlos José died without an heir. All because the Habsburg obsession with purity created a king who couldn't function, couldn't reproduce, couldn't do the one thing dynasties require. All because marrying cousins for 200 years finally collapsed the bloodline so completely that nature itself refused to continue it. One man's genetic catastrophe becomes Europe's bloodiest war in generations. The irony would be funny if it weren't written in corpses and burned cities, and mothers weeping over sons who won't come home. Picture a soldier 18 years old, conscripted from a village in Flanders whose name no one remembers. He dies in a trench outside Brussels in 1706, bayoneted by someone he never saw. Someone who probably didn't want to kill him either. He's never heard of Carlos Jose, doesn't know the Spanish king's name, doesn't understand why he's fighting beyond the fact that his duke called him to serve and refusing meant punishment or death. He just knows he's bleeding out in mud, calling for his mother, with his last breaths dying for reasons that have nothing to do with him. A French cavalry officer, 32 years old, with a wife and 2 children in Normandy charges at Blenheim. He's cut down by English musket fire before he gets within 50 yards of the enemy line, falls from his horse, landing hard, bones breaking on impact, lies there dying slowly, while the battle continues around him, men stepping over his body, the noise deafening. He dies thinking about his wife, about the child she's carrying, that he'll never meet, about promises he made that he can't keep. He has no idea this war traces back to a deformed king in Madrid who never spoke a word, never understood politics, never comprehended that his inability to produce an heir would kill thousands. A Spanish peasant woman watches soldiers burn her village. She doesn't even know which side they're on, doesn't care anymore. French-Austrian doesn't matter. Soldiers are soldiers, and they destroy everything they touch. Her husband is dead, killed in the first year. Her sons are conscripted, marched off to fight in armies that promise glory and deliver only mass graves. Her home is ashes, her animals stolen or slaughtered, her future erased. She knows nothing of royal bloodlines or succession crises or the complex politics that led to this. She only knows that the powerful have once again destroyed the powerless, that kings and nobles play their games, and ordinary people pay the price in blood. The war grinds on year after year, consuming lives and treasure and hope. By 1710, everyone is exhausted. The treasuries are empty, drained by the constant need to pay soldiers, buy weapons, maintain armies in the field. The populations are depleted, entire generations of young men killed or crippled. The enthusiasm that started the war has long since turned to grim resignation, and it's become clear that neither side can achieve total victory, that the war could continue indefinitely, destroying Europe piece by piece. So they negotiate, because eventually even the most stubborn realize that endless war serves no one. The Treaty of Utrecht is signed in 1713, with additional treaties following in 1714. The terms are complex, the result of years of bargaining and compromise. Philip V gets to keep the Spanish throne. He's already been ruling for over a decade anyway, already established himself in Madrid. But the price Spain pays is devastating. The Spanish Netherlands go to Austria. The Italian territories, Milan, Naples, Sicily, divided between Austria and Savoy. Gibraltar ceded to Britain forever. Minorca to Britain as well. Trading rights in the Spanish Americas granted to Britain. Spain's position as a great power essentially ends. The vast empire that Carlos Jose inherited, however nominally, however incapable he was of understanding what he ruled, is carved up like a feast among the victors. And there's one more condition written into the treaty's core, the clause that matters most. The French and Spanish thrones can never unite under one ruler. Philip V can be king of Spain, but he and his descendants renounce forever any claim to France. If he inherits France, he must give up Spain. If a Spanish king becomes king of France, he must choose one throne and abandon the other. The two crowns must remain separate forever. It's a direct repudiation of what Louis XIV wanted, what the entire war was fought over from his perspective. The whole point from France's view was to unite the kingdoms under Bourbon rule. He failed. At 75 years old, in the final year of his life, the Sun King has to accept defeat. His grandson sits on the Spanish throne, yes, but Spain is a shadow of what it was stripped of its European territories, and France has gained nothing but debt-exhausted soldiers and a generation of young men buried in foreign soil. The Austrian Habsburgs gain some Italian territory, which they call victory. Britain gains Gibraltar and trading rights, which will prove valuable in the coming century. The Dutch Republic survives, which was their main goal. But everyone lost something. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions more suffering from famine, disease, displacement, caused by armies marching back and forth across the same territories year after year. An entire continent reshaped, borders redrawn, the balance of power permanently altered, all stemming from one terrible idea repeated across 2 centuries, that you could marry your cousins forever and expect no consequences, that blood could stay pure without becoming poisoned, that nature would allow you to break its rules indefinitely without sending a bill.
Carlos José was the warning everyone ignored until it was too late to ignore. His twisted body, his broken mind, his inability to function, these were nature's alarm bells ringing for decades. But the dynasty was already too far gone to stop the pattern, too committed to the strategy. The machine had been running for 200 years, powered by pride and fear and the logic of power. And when it finally broke down completely, when the last defective king died, childless and alone in a bed soaked with his own fluids, Europe burned. That's the real legacy, the truth that portraits can't hide and official histories try to soften. Not the medical curiosity of extreme inbreeding, though that's certainly there. Not the portrait of a deformed king hanging in museums, though visitors still stop and stare. The real legacy is the war. The hundreds of thousands who died because powerful people refused to admit they'd made a mistake generations earlier, refused to marry outside the family when they should have, refused to bring in fresh blood when the warning signs appeared, refused to change the strategy until nature forced the issue by creating a king so broken he couldn't produce heirs. And by then it was too late. The dynasty ended, and the war began, and Europe's map was redrawn in blood. El Escorial, 1750. 50 years have passed since Carlos José's death. The War of the Spanish Succession is over, fading into memory for the old and into history books for the young. Spain is now ruled by Bourbon kings Philip V and his son Ferdinand VI. The empire is smaller, weaker, but at least stable. The Habsburgs are gone from Spain forever, though they still rule in Austria. The monastery palace of El Escorial remains massive and imposing, exactly as it was 50 years ago. Some things don't change. The royal crypt below the church still holds the remains of Spanish kings and queens in rows of identical tombs. A visitor descends the stone stairs, candle in hand, wanting to see where the Habsburgs are buried, curious about history. The air is cool down here, smelling of stone and time, the faint sweetness of decay that never quite leaves crypts, no matter how well sealed. He walks past the tombs, slowly reading the Latin inscriptions carved into marble. Carlos V, the emperor who ruled half the world. Felipe II, who built this very palace. Felipe III, Felipe IV. The names of empire builders, of conquerors, of kings, whose decisions shaped continents. Generations of power and glory carved in stone. Then at the end of the Habsburg row,
smaller than the others, less ornate, Carlos II. The inscription is brief, almost embarrassed in its brevity. No grand titles beyond the necessary ones, no celebration of achievements, there were none to celebrate. No lengthy recitation of territories ruled, though technically he ruled them all, however nominally. Just his name and the dates.
Carolus Secundus Rex Hispaniae, 1661 to 1700, 39 years. The visitor stands there for a long moment thinking about the stories he's heard. The mad king. The bewitched one. El Hechizado, they called him. The last Spanish Habsburg. The king who couldn't speak or walk or rule. The king whose death started a war that killed hundreds of thousands. Was it his fault? The visitor wonders aloud, his voice barely a whisper in the crypt, not expecting an answer. A monk passing through on his rounds of prayer hears the question. He pauses, considering whether to engage. Then, no, the monk says quietly, voice echoing softly off stone. He didn't choose to be born, didn't choose his parents, didn't choose the blood in his veins or the body it created. Then whose fault was it? The monk pauses, candle flame flickering, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The ones who came before. The ones who knew better, but chose pride over wisdom.
The ones who thought they could ignore nature's laws because they wore crowns and commanded armies. He looks at the tomb, at the name carved in marble, and the ones who came after, the ones who went to war over his empty throne instead of finding peace, everyone who turned one man's tragedy into an excuse for violence and conquest. The visitor nods slowly, understanding, settling like weight. Could it happen again? Could a family make the same mistake? No, the monk says, with certainty. Or at least not the same way. The world is learning slowly. Knowledge spreads. People understand more about how bodies work, how inheritance functions, even if they don't have all the answers. But pride, fear, the desire for power and purity, those haven't changed. Those are human nature, and human nature doesn't evolve as fast as human knowledge. They stand in silence for a moment, two living men contemplating death and history and human folly. Above them, Spain continues under Bourbon rule. The empire is smaller now, less powerful, still recovering from the war and from decades of Habsburg decline before that. But it endures, change certainly, diminished undeniably, but alive in ways Carlos Jose never was, functioning in ways his broken body never could. The visitor thanks the monk and leaves, climbing back up stone stairs toward light and air. The monk returns to his prayer's voice, joining the eternal hum of devotion that fills El Escorial day and night. And in his tomb, Carlos Jose rests in darkness, surrounded by ancestors who created him through choices that seemed reasonable at the time. Unknown to him, unknowable to him, even if he could wake, his story has become something more than personal tragedy. A cautionary tale whispered in medical schools, where doctors are beginning to understand heredity, are starting to grasp why marrying close relatives is dangerous. A case study debated in royal courts, where marriage policies are slowly, reluctantly changing. A warning about the dangers of isolation, of pride, of refusing to evolve or adapt or admit mistakes. But he knows none of this. He is simply gone beyond pain and confusion and suffering. And perhaps that's mercy. The final mercy he was denied in life. Vienna, 1866. A monk named Gregor Mendel publishes a paper about pea plants, about traits and inheritance, about patterns he's discovered through careful observation and experimentation, about how characteristics pass from parent to offspring following mathematical rules, about dominant and recessive traits, about the laws governing heredity. It's the birth of genetics as a science, though few recognize it immediately, though it will take decades for his work to be truly understood and appreciated. But some scholars reading Mendel's work in quiet libraries and university offices think immediately of the Habsburgs, of that jaw that appeared again and again across generations, of the mental problems that plagued the later rulers, of Carlos José, the final terrible example of accumulated genetic damage. They begin to understand finally what the family did to itself. Not witchcraft, not divine punishment, not bad luck or curses or demonic possession, just mathematics, just biology following its inexorable rules, as reliable as gravity or the movement of planets. When you marry cousins repeatedly, generation after generation, you reduce the variety in your genetic material. Recessive traits, the harmful ones usually hidden when you have two different copies, find matching copies in both parents and express themselves, becoming visible, becoming undeniable. Generation after generation, the probability increases like compound interest on a loan, until eventually you get Carlos José, the perfect storm of accumulated flaws finding each other. Every broken instruction matching its mirror.
Every hidden defect becoming visible. Every weakness doubling and amplifying. The scholars write papers with titles like Genetic Analysis of the Habsburg Dynasty and Consanguinity and Royal Inbreeding. They use the Habsburgs as case studies in heredity, in the dangers of limited genetic diversity. They calculate the inbreeding coefficient, the measure of how related someone's parents are for each generation. For Carlos José, the number is shocking to even experienced geneticists, nearly as high as what you'd expect from siblings having children. Not because his parents were siblings, they weren't, they were uncle and niece, but because 200 years of cousin marriages had created the same effect, had narrowed the bloodline until the distance between relatives collapsed to nearly nothing. The family tree had become a circle, and Carlos José paid the price.
The research spread slowly through European universities, through medical schools, through the growing scientific community. Medical students study his autopsy report, unsealed, now no longer a dangerous secret, just historical data. They marvel at how he survived at all, with organs so malformed, with systems so broken. Some call it a medical miracle that he lived 39 years. Others call it prolonged suffering, a body that didn't know when to quit. But everyone agrees it should never have happened, could have been prevented, would have been prevented if anyone had understood what they were doing. And slowly, very slowly, royal marriage practices begin to change across Europe. Not immediately, not universally. Old habits die hard, especially when they're tied to pride and power and tradition. But the whispers start in palace corridors, in private conversations between advisors and rulers. Maybe marrying your first cousin isn't wise after all. Maybe bringing in outside blood strengthens the family rather than weakening it. Maybe purity is another word for vulnerability. Maybe the Habsburgs were a warning that should be heeded. By the early 1900s, European royalty is intermarrying less often with close relatives, looking to more distant connections, bringing in fresh bloodlines. They're learning the lesson the Habsburgs taught at such terrible cost. But it's too late for Carlos José. Too late for the hundreds of thousands who died in the war over his succession. Too late to undo 200 years of choices made with the best intentions and the worst outcomes. The knowledge came too late, as knowledge often does. The warning was given, but only after the disaster had already happened. Museo del Prado, Madrid. Present day, the museum is busy on a Saturday afternoon, tourists flowing through galleries filled with centuries of Spanish art. Velázquez's masterpieces draw crowds. Goya's dark paintings make people pause and think. But in a smaller gallery, less visited, hang portraits of the Spanish royal family across generations. And there among them, Carlos José's official portrait. It's not particularly large or impressive compared to some of the other works, not dramatically lit like the Caravaggios in another wing, not technically brilliant like the Velázquez portraits nearby. But those who stop, who read the small placard explaining who he was, who look closely at the painted face, they see it. Even in paint, even with all the artist's careful techniques to minimize it, even with strategic lighting and carefully chosen angles, they see the jaw protruding forward in a way that's unmistakable once you know to look for it. They see the slightly vacant expression that the painter tried to make look contemplative but couldn't quite hide. They see the truth that 200 years of Habsburg portraits tried to soften but could never entirely conceal. A mother and daughter stand before the portrait together. The daughter, maybe 12, asks the question children always ask when something seems wrong. Why does he look like that? The mother reads the placard, which explains briefly and carefully Carlos II, last of the Spanish Habsburgs, suffered from health problems due to extensive inbreeding within his family over many generations. She translates it into language her daughter can understand. His family married their relatives, cousins mostly, for many, many years. And eventually it caused problems, bad problems, the daughter observes, looking at the painted face with the mixture of curiosity and discomfort children feel when confronting difference. Yes, very bad problems. They stand there for another moment, the question hanging in the air between them. Did he know? The daughter asks, voice quiet.
That it wasn't his fault, that his family did this to him. The mother pauses, considering, how do you answer that? Carlos Jose probably didn't understand much of anything, didn't have the mental capacity to grasp concepts like fault or blame or the weight of inherited tragedy. Probably spent his entire life confused, frightened, struggling to make sense of a world he couldn't comprehend.
I don't know. The mother finally says, honesty the only real answer. I hope so. I hope someone told him kindly that none of it was his fault, but she doesn't really believe it, and her daughter can probably tell. They move on to the next painting, the next room, the rest of their museum visit. But the image stays with them both, the twisted jaw, the painted eyes, the sense of tragedy captured in oil and canvas. The portrait remains on the wall as it has for centuries. Tourists take photos, selfies, sometimes not really understanding or caring about the history. Students sketch it for art classes, focusing on technique rather than meaning. Historians study it for books and documentaries about royal inbreeding, about the dangers of dynastic marriage strategies, about what happens when power becomes too concentrated. And sometimes, rarely, someone stands before it and truly sees just the deformed jaw or the official history, but the human being trapped inside the tragedy. The child who never asked to be born into a body that didn't work. The young man who never wanted a crown he couldn't understand. The king who suffered for choices made generations before his birth. And in those rare moments of recognition across 4 centuries, and an unbridgeable gulf of time and circumstance, something like compassion crosses the distance. For Carlos Jose, yes, but also for all the victims of family ambition, of pride, disguised as tradition, of systems that value bloodlines over human beings. For everyone who pays the price for someone else's mistakes. For everyone trapped by circumstances they didn't create and can't escape. The portrait hangs in silence as it has for 300 years. As it will for 300 more, probably. A warning painted in flesh tones and shadow. A reminder rendered in careful brush strokes. A question that still echoes through time. How many warnings do we need before we finally learn to listen? How many tragedies before we change the systems that create them? How many more Carlos José's will the world create before we understand that blood alone doesn't make someone fit to rule? that purity is a dangerous illusion, that concentrating power in ever narrower circles always ends in disaster. The portrait has no answers, it only asks and waits, and remembers what the history books sometimes forget, that behind every dynasty's fall, every empire's collapse, every tragic footnote in the grand story of nations and kings, there are human beings, suffering, struggling, hoping for something better that never comes. Carlos Jose didn't destroy his empire. The empire destroyed itself, using his body as an excuse, using his suffering as the final excuse to tear Europe apart in war. And now he rests in darkness beneath El Escorial, his name a cautionary tale, his life a warning. The last Habsburg king of Spain, the final bill come due, the reckoning made flesh, silent, still, forever.